those 20 ways, which does seem rather a lot, and ensure that we have well-qualified teachers to teach pupils to a high standard?
One of the main things we're doing, I thank my honourable friend for her question, is to make sure that we have bursaries to attract teachers in particularly those subjects where there's a lot of competition for those skills. And I actually am hoping to actually increase the routes, because we are looking to have an apprenticeship for teaching at undergraduate, so that people who need to earn and learn can also be attracted into teaching.
Senator Stephen Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Having dumped the schools bill, the only education policy this government seems to have is a gimmick announcement on making maths compulsory until 18, a plan that experts say is unachievable in light of the teacher recruitment crisis. What discussion did the Secretary of State have with the Prime Minister before his announcement? Because surely they would have told him it was unworkable, given that the government has missed its recruitment target for maths teachers in each of the last 10 years.
So we have very much a focus on making sure that our standards are very high in school, and making sure that our children have the very best education so that they compete globally when they need to get into the workforce. Now, if you look at every other developed economy, pretty much all of them, their children do maths of some form up to the age of 18, and we're a bit of an outlier. So what we're doing is looking to raise the expectations and standards to make sure that our children can compete, and also give them skills for life as well with financial. Now, of course, we will work with the sector, and it is a longer term strategy to make sure that we do have enough maths teachers. We do have a number of strategies already in place, because it is always tough to recruit maths teachers, but that's why we have introduced a bursary of up to £27,000 for all maths teachers, and also many science teachers.
Mary McCarthy.
Question 3, Mr Speaker.
With permission, Mr Speaker, I'll answer questions 3 and 10 together. All children, no matter their special educational need or disability, deserve the right support to be able to succeed. We will be publishing a full response to the SEND AP Green Paper in an improvement plan early this year, and we continue to work closely with children, families and education, healthcare and local government sectors on this very important issue.
Mary McCarthy.
Today is Blue Monday, and I'm sure both you, Mr Speaker, and the Education Secretary will be pleased to know that following the event we did last year, the band New Order and the charity Calm have teamed up together today to urge people not to hold back from seeking help with their mental health if they need it. But as we discussed at that event, too many children are facing unconscionable delays in getting assessed and in getting support. Too many children risk being damaged for life as a result. So can the Minister please get a move on and bring forward the response to the SEND review consultation? Children shouldn't have to wait any longer.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. I can assure her we're working incredibly hard and we'll be publishing a response imminently. In the meantime, we are rolling out training on mental health for all schools across the country, and I'm working very hard with my counterparts at Health to make sure that when we look at the proposals on SEND, that they are brought fully into the picture as well.
Deborah Johnson.
Speaker, I have many local parents in Oxfordshire who are unhappy with the County Council for a variety of reasons, from emails that are never answered to EHCPs that come back with details about the wrong child on them, or just long delays in receiving the EHCP. My honourable friend will know many parents want this, as it's become the only way to get support for their children, where they might have been able to get support at an earlier stage from school and that not be necessary. Can she tell us what steps she's taking to address this?
Well, I know my honourable friend has raised this issue with me several times, and one of the key parts of the reforms that the SEND Green Paper will set out is clear standards for what help children with different SEND needs should be getting in school, because that will give parents greater transparency and accountability in what their child should reasonably get. But it also means those children will get the early help that my honourable friend so rightly talks about.
Ben Bradshaw.
Mr Speaker, she will be aware that Devon Children's Services has been failing now for many years, with special educational needs being a particular problem. Following the latest inspector's damning report, the County Council has belatedly appointed a new head of Children's Services. But will she make absolutely clear to the political leadership of Devon County Council that if things don't improve quickly, she will have no hesitation in stripping Devon of its responsibility for children's services?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. We do work with all areas who are struggling to provide SEND through our regions group work, through our Delivering Better Value programmes and our safety valve programmes. So I will of course look at this issue very carefully, and we always step in and act when we need to.
Jonathan Gillis.
Mr. Speaker, one of the best ways that young people with SEND can be supported is by remaining in the local area to be educated. That's why I'm delighted, thanks to a significant amount of government investment, that Middlehurst School, which is currently sitting empty, is now being built to create 80 new SEND school places. Will my honourable friend congratulate Councillor Janine Bridges and Stoke-on-Trent City Council for this amazing work, and pledge to come open it when it's ready, hopefully at the end of this year?
Here, here.
Well, I will absolutely commend the work of Councillor Janine Bridges, who sounds like she's doing a tremendous job to increase the number of places for SEND children, and I'd be delighted to come in and see whether I can open it as well.
Robin Walker.
Question 4, please, Mr. Speaker.
I know how important childcare is to the Chair, and I look forward to seeing his committee's report on this. Getting this right is fundamentally important for parents and children, and my honourable friend, the Minister for Children, Families and Wellbeing, is looking at all options to improve the cost, flexibility and availability of childcare, and crucially outcomes for children. It may interest the members opposite that since 2010 we have doubled Labour's offer from 15 hours to 30 hours of free childcare for 3 to 4 year olds. We've also introduced 15 hours free childcare a week for disadvantaged 2-year-olds, and parents on universal credit can claim back up to 85% of their childcare costs.
I'm grateful to the Secretary of State for that answer, and she's right to set out what has been achieved. But as she will recognise, the issue of access to affordable and high-quality childcare is high on the agenda of parents and of members right across this House, and it's something that, as she's recognised, the Select Committee are looking into. There's been much speculation in the media as to whether this remains a priority for the Government. Can she reassure me and the Committee that she does plan further reform and investment in this space?
I thank my honourable friend for his question, and I can reassure him and the whole House that childcare is important to this Government. I met with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury on this actually only last week. Helping working families to take up childcare and remain in work is a Government priority, and we've also taken some steps to make sure this happens. And we also want to make sure that people are going to benefit from a lot of the schemes that we have in place, as some of them are underutilised. So we do have a £1.2 million childcare choices campaign to increase the usage of those. But we will go further, and we are looking at all options to improve the affordability and availability of childcare and, crucially, outcomes for children.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sadly, childcare is not the only thing that parents are struggling to afford to pay for, and I'm very grateful to Karen Taylor from Rooted in Hull for drawing to my attention the work done by the Child Poverty Action Group on poverty-proofing schools. And what this does is provides a toolkit for schools to look at their academic year and to identify times when they're asking parents to pay money, and then to try to find ways to alleviate this and reduce the cost to parents. So will the Secretary of State join me in encouraging many schools up and down the country, academy chains and head teachers, to have a look at this toolkit and do what they can to reduce the costs associated with sending their child to school?
I thank the honourable lady for her question. And of course, we're always focused on what more we can do. We obviously have pupil premium funding, but we also have school uniform guidance. Obviously, we have the highest number of children benefiting from free school meals as well, and in deprived areas, breakfast clubs, which we have introduced. But of course, we all know that economically times are tough, which is why we're very much focused on trying to get inflation down, and the Prime Minister's pledge to halve inflation this year.
Shadow Minister Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Childcare is essential social infrastructure which underpins our economy by supporting parents to work. Yet in 2022, more than 5,000 childcare providers closed, and more than half of all local authority areas saw a net loss of childcare places. The government has admitted that they pay providers less than it cost them to deliver the so-called free childcare places, and with energy bills and wages going up from April, many more providers are at risk of closure. There is a crisis in our early years sector happening right now. What is the government going to do to stop further childcare providers from closing?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for a question. Actually, Ofsted data shows that the number of childcare places has remained broadly stable at 1.3 million since August 2015. But at the spending review 2021, we announced additional funding of £160 million in 22-23 and £180 million in 23-24 and £170 million 24-25. And that's compared to the 2021-22 financial year. And this will allow local authorities to increase hourly rates paid to childcare providers.
Peter Alders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Number 5.
We are transforming people's life chances by enabling them to climb the education skills ladder of opportunity. And on the 9th of January this year, we announced that in financial year 2023-24, we will increase funding rates to invest a further £125 million in 16 to 19 education. £18.5 million in 16 to 19 education has been invested in institutions that cover the constituency of Waveney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm most grateful to my right honourable friend for that answer. But taking into account both the urgent need to address acute skills shortages in key sectors of the economy and the fact that participation in adult education has fallen from 4.4 million in 2003-2004 to 1.5 million in 2019-2020, it is vital that the capacity of further education is significantly expanded. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, highlighted the importance of investment in skills in his autumn statement. And I'll be grateful if my right honourable friend could set out the work that is being done to meet this challenge ahead of the spring statement.
Well, my honourable friend is an FE champion, and I welcome his question. And he will be pleased to know that we're investing in resources, increasing skills funding by 3.6 billion over this Parliament, investing in qualifications like T-levels, higher technical qualifications, free level 3 courses, boot camps and apprenticeships, and investing in infrastructure as well, rolling out 21 institutes of technologies, spending £290 million.
Rishi.
Come on, my old friend. He can do better than that. The fact of the matter is, still, further education in our country is a Cinderella service. When will you wake up to the fact that we need more skilled people in our country? We need them desperately, and the FE sector is the one area that you could actually do the real investment that pays back very quickly. Can I urge the Minister, who I like a lot, we're old friends, get his act together and put some real heft into further education?
When the honourable gentleman describes FE as the Cinderella sector, I might remind you that Cinderella became a member of the royal family, and it's this government. It's this government that is banishing the two ugly sisters of under-resourcing and snobbery about further education and skills. And as I said in my previous answer to my honourable friend, we're investing a 3.6 billion extra in skills in this Parliament, 3.8 billion, I should say, and 1.6 billion extra for FE, increasing the number of hours students learn. I'm very proud of this government's approach to further education and skills.
Right, let us move to Shadow Minister Toby Perkins.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the Minister was a huge champion for the FE sector when he was the Select Committee Chair, so it will be depressing to hear that he's now speaking up for this government. This government's funding settlements for FE colleges are the worst in post-war history. Not my view, the view of the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies. Their analysis exposes that per-student funding fell 14% in real terms between 2010 and 2019. Isn't the reality that after 13 years of this government, it's only the election of a Labour government that will allow our colleges to play the role that we truly need from them?
So I say to my honourable friend, it's wishful thinking on his part. I mean, the government is increasing investment in apprenticeships to 2.7 billion by 2024-25. We'll be investing an extra 1.6 billion in 16 to 19 education at the same period of time. That includes 500 million a year for T-levels. I mentioned the 290 million pounds that's being spent on Institute of Technologies. and £1.5 billion to commit and upgrade FE College Estate in England over the next few years. So this is a government that's investing and championing further education and skills, and my honourable friend should recognise that.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
As set out in our Send and Alternative Provision Green Paper published in March, our ambitious alternative provision reforms will equip all children in AP with the right support in the right setting at the right time. Our reforms will enable children with behaviour that present barriers to learning or medical needs to have the support, skills and confidence needed to thrive.
Rob Butler. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that answer. Many of the children I've met in the youth justice system have been excluded from mainstream schools and instead sent to alternative provision, where often the standards are very good, but sadly that is far from always the case. Indeed, the Youth Justice Board on which I used to sit said an improvement in standards and practice is needed across alternative provision. So what action is the Minister taking to make sure that alternative provision isn't a dumping ground for difficult pupils that mainstream schools want to exclude, and that by contrast it's high quality teaching and welfare support that is always the case in AP?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend. I know he's a passionate believer in youth justice. In fact, I think the first time we met, that's what we were speaking about. And he is right to be concerned about this area. We know there are some great AP settings. Indeed, I was talking to Mark Vickers of Olive Academies recently. But we know that some settings are delivering very poor outcomes for young people. I really am excited about our proposals on AP. I think they will be transformational. I'll be happy to discuss them further with the honourable member.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Funding for alternative provision for children who are unwell peters out after the age of 16. There was no mention in last November's budget of colleges. I've got a constituent in Devon whose mother I spoke to this morning. The son has been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma and is unable to get the online tuition that he needs from our local college. So I wonder, when might colleges receive the additional revenue funding so that they might be able to afford the alternative provision for children diagnosed with illnesses like my constituent?
So, as part of the reforms that we're setting out, we'll be developing a bespoke national alternative framework that will include looking at standards, looking at sustainable post-16 destinations, and I'd be happy to discuss with the honourable gentleman further once we've published our proposals.
Leanne Park.
Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 7 and 22 together. Family hubs are one-stop shops that make it easier for families to get the support they need, and I strongly support them. The government is investing £300 million in the Start for Life and Family Hubs programme, and 75 local authorities will begin to open hubs later this year.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. East Sussex County Council submitted an excellent bid for a network of family hubs across East Sussex, and we know that family hubs are a part of the solution to many national and local issues and are vitally needed in many of our local communities now more than ever. In addition to the rollout of family hubs, what steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that this fantastic policy has long-term funding to maximise long-term benefits?
Hear, hear. I thank my honourable friend for her question, and I strongly agree with my honourable friend. We are funding 75 councils for the current spending review period, and I have no doubt that the excellent work in East Sussex, led by Becky Shaw and her excellent team, and across the country, will make the case for further investment.
Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the work this government is doing with family hubs, early years and start to life. In Wales, each seeking to give babies and young children the very best start to life. In Wales, every community has a Cilch Meithrin, an informal group of mothers, babies and young children. It's a tradition almost in Wales of care within the community. But the more formal support for the early years is more variable across Wales. I wonder, could the Minister tell me what arrangements there are for sharing or exchanging these best practices with the Welsh Government on important areas such as this?
I thank the honourable friend for his question. We do have regular meetings actually with all of the devolved authorities, and we do share ideas as well of what we're doing and different policies so that we can learn from each other, and we can, there's no monopoly on good ideas. We're always open to listening and sharing.
Rachel Maskell.
Mr. Speaker, since the publication of the independent review into children's social services, which also will improve the use of family hubs, Hundreds of children have been taken into care, while millions of profit have been put out into the private sector. So when is she going to publish the government's delayed response to this review? And will she look at York being a pilot to ensure that we can move this forward quickly?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and I just want to assure that this is work that my Honourable friend, the Minister for Children's, Families and Wellbeing, is working very actively on, and it will be published very soon. And I'm sure that my Honourable friend will be happy to discuss further how we will roll that out and implement it.
Teresa Villiers.
Question number 8, Mr. Speaker, sir.
Maintained nursery schools make an invaluable contribution to improving the lives of disadvantaged children. We're investing an additional £10 million into their supplementary funding from 23-24, taking the total around £70 million, and reforming the distribution of this funding to make it fairer, ensuring all authorities with maintained nursery schools receive supplementary funding.
Teresa Villiers.
Can I warmly welcome that extra funding, because it means that for the first time, maintained nursery schools in Barnet get a share of this supplementary funding. So will she join me in welcoming this funding, and will she express her strong support for the maintained nursery school sector in the future?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend. I know she has consistently and passionately campaigned for the maintained nursery school sector, and I agree they're doing an excellent job, not only in supporting some of the most disadvantaged children, but also in sharing their expertise and knowledge with other providers as well.
Rita Hobhouse.
Speaker, in my Bath constituency, Midford Road Nursery was sadly forced to close its doors. The staff shortage is the major reason why they had to close, and many nurseries in Bath face similar problems, and parents struggle to find alternatives. What advice would the Minister give to parents in Bath who struggle to find a nursery?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. We have actually, in terms of early years, increased funding by about £500 million set out since 2021. I do agree that workforce is an issue, and we're looking at recruitment and retention very carefully, and we'll be setting out proposals as and when we can.
James Wilde.
Number 9, please, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I will answer questions 9 and 15 together. In December, I announced a further 239 schools that will benefit from large-scale rebuilding and refurbishment projects as part of our school rebuilding programme, which will transform 500 schools across the country. I saw the huge impacts our investments having at Camden Court School, where I met Mr Heel, a head teacher, and his students that were very excited at the prospect of their new classrooms and design and tech and science labs. Mr. Speaker, as Conservatives, we're not only investing in the next generation's future, but of that of generations to come. On top of this, we have allocated over £13 billion to improving school buildings since 2015, including £1.8 billion this year.
Thank you. I welcome the recent addition of the King Edward VII Academy to the rebuilding programme, following the inclusion of Smithton High School in an earlier round and the new investment that's coming to North West Norfolk. However, can my right honourable friend assure me that given Smithton's Grade 2 star listed status and the complexity that brings, that the funding for that school is protected, and will ministers meet me to ensure that we get the heritage and other permissions we need as rapidly as possible?
I thank the Honourable Friend for his question. My department is working closely with heritage and planning officers to ensure that we can address the condition of Smithton High as quickly as possible, whilst recognising the listed status of the buildings. We're working on the project with Historic England and the 20th Century Society, and would be very happy to provide the Honourable Member to meet with him and to provide an update on progress.
Sarah Britley.
Mr. Speaker, in Hyndburn and Haslingden, we received the fantastic news just before Christmas that Hyndburn Academy and Haslingden High School will be included in the next round of the schools rebuilding programme, and I eagerly await the next round so schools in my patch like the Hollins can apply. Can my right honourable friend confirm whether schools rebuilding programme funding can be used in conjunction with other investment for initiatives that not only benefit the school but the wider community as well?
Thank my honourable friend for an excellent question. We do encourage schools to play a positive role in their communities, with many choosing to provide access to sports and other facilities. The school rebuilding programme directly commissions projects rather than providing funding to schools, so where feasible we include additional facilities beyond the scope of a project, and if it's funded by the local trust or the local authority. But we are interested in making sure that school facilities do benefit the wider community.
Laurie Vars.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Member for Bognor Regis visited Joseph Lecky, and that really helped.
I had a good meeting with the heads of Joseph Leckey and Bluecoat Academy with my friend, the Honourable Member for Worcester, but they've still lost out. Will the Secretary of State or one of her ministers meet with me and the heads of those two schools to find out why on earth they cannot be successful in getting funding for these vital repairs?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Yes, we'd be very happy to meet, and obviously there are some schools that are disappointed that they didn't get access to this funding, but we have now announced 400 schools so far, but there are still another 100 in future rounds as well, but we'd be very happy to meet with her.
Leah Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A Schools Week investigation found at least 40 schools contain so-called aero-concrete, and a further 150 need further investigation. Officials described the concrete as life expired and liable to collapse, which is extremely alarming. Now, NHS England says that it will take until 2035 to remove this aero-concrete from all our hospitals. Will we be waiting as long as that for our schools as well?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. The Government published updated guidance on identifying and managing reinforced aerated concrete last year. In March 22, all schools were asked to complete a questionnaire about the knowledge of RAC, its presence in their buildings, and if they have it, how they're managing it. Where the presence of RAC is confirmed, we help with those schools with the appropriate technical support, and we are looking to make sure that we continue that programme.
Daniel Kaczynski.
Question 11, sir.
Many schools and colleges already mark Holocaust Memorial Day. I've attended such a remembrance service in Harlow College, and this is all the more important. They work closely with the Holocaust Memorial Trust and the Holocaust Educational Trust, two institutions that the government give support. This is all the more important given that there were 128 incidents of anti-Semitism in our higher education institutions. That's sadly at an all-time high.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for that answer. Can I ask him that in addition to educating children about the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War, can we also take the opportunity to educate children about the tremendous courage and bravery and sacrifices of the righteous among nations? Many people on the continent gave up their lives to protect their Jewish friends and neighbours. And one example is a member of my family, Jan Kawczynski, his wife Helena, and their 13-year-old daughter Magdalena, all shot by the Germans for protecting and hiding their Jewish friends and neighbours on their estate in Western Poland. As well as educating children about the misery of the Holocaust, we must give them inspiration that many of our brothers and sisters in occupied Europe gave the ultimate sacrifice to protect friends and neighbours of the Jewish faith.
Here, here, here. I'd have to say it's very moving to hear of your family's experience, and I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. We must teach and remind people that there were many righteous Gentiles who suffered doing everything possible to save Jews. And if I can mention another famous Polish lady, Irene Sendler, who saved 2,000 Jewish children from the Warsaw ghettos, and was remembered in a special exhibition in Parliament, in the Commons in 2018, of which I was pleased to attend. But my honourable friend makes a really powerful point, and I'm sure schools up and down the country will be listening to what he says.
Question number 12, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. We're improving quality in apprenticeships. Ofsted will be inspecting every apprenticeship provider by 2025. All providers have been asked to re-register with the Register of Providers. We're intervening to help apprentices and employers as well.
Paul Bowles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My local college, Eastleigh College, work alongside 700 regional employers to deliver high-quality apprenticeships right through to degree level. Last year, nearly a third of apprenticeship starts were higher level. So can I ask what steps the government is taking to broaden the routes into technical education and increase the number of higher level apprenticeship starts?
Question. He will be pleased to know there have been over 10,800 apprenticeship starts in his constituency since 2010. We're investing £2.7 billion in apprenticeships by 2025. We're spending some of that, £8 million on promoting degree-level apprenticeships. We have a big recruitment campaign, Fire It Up, to try and encourage more apprentices. We're transforming careers advice on apprenticeships in schools and colleges. And of course, we pay non-levy payers, small businesses, the vast majority of their training costs when they hire apprenticeships.
Kate.
Question 13, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The law is clear that schools must prohibit the promotion of partisan political views and should take steps to ensure the balanced presentation of opposing views on political issues when these are being taught. Guidance to schools on political impartiality was published in February 22. It summarises the legal position and makes it clear that steps taken to ensure these legal duties are met should be reasonable and proportionate.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. You don't have to be a historian to understand the dangers of indoctrinating children. And yet polling by YouGov for Policy Exchange shows that the majority of UK children are being taught political ideology as fact in school. For example, gender ideology, which states that children can be born in the wrong body and men can have babies, or critical race theories that say race is a social construct, or sex positivity, such as in this document, which instructs teachers of children with learning disabilities to simulate sexual arousal on anatomically correct dolls while playing sexy music in class. These are not isolated incidents, but endemic in our schools. The guidance is not working. What does the Minister intend to do about it?
The guidance on political impartiality does make it very clear that when teaching about sensitive political issues relating to discrimination, teachers should be mindful to avoid promoting partisan views or presenting contested theories as fact. Schools need to ensure that any resources used in the classroom, particularly if they've been produced by an external organisation, are age-appropriate, suitable and politically impartial. And schools should consult parents and they should share lesson materials when parents ask to see them.
Question
14, Mr Speaker.
The Government supports the provision of nutritious food in schools, which ensures children are well nourished, develop healthy eating habits and can concentrate and learn. 1.9 million pupils are eligible for free school meals. That's an increase from 2021, when 1.7 million pupils were eligible. In large part, the increase is due to protections put in place to support families as they move to universal credit. In addition, of course, 1.25 million pupils are eligible under the Universal Infant Free School Meal Programme.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Each month, 4 million children experience food insecurity, going to bed hungry and then setting off to school on an empty stomach. To tackle this injustice, my free school meals for all bill would guarantee that every child in England would get a hot, healthy meal each day, just as been done in Scotland and Wales. It could be paid for twice over by removing the private schools' £1.7 billion tax break, a move that the party opposite blocked last week. My bill is due to get its second reading on Friday, so I asked the Minister, will he back my bill, or does he believe that protecting tax breaks for elite private schools is more important than feeding hungry children?
Well, Mr Speaker, the Government has extended free school meals to more groups of children than any other government over the past century, including Labour governments in that period. So there was an increase, as I've said earlier, from 1.7 million to 1.9 million. There's an extension to 85,000 students in FE colleges introduced by this government, and there's new eligibility for some children of families with no recourse to public funds. And of course, the 1.25 million children in infant schools, again, another scheme introduced by this government.
SNP spokesperson Carol Muller.
Mr Speaker, the Levelling Up Secretary said in October that extending free school meal provision would be the most timely, effective and targeted of all public health interventions that this government could make. The Scottish Government has already committed to universal free school meals for primary children. Does the Minister agree with his colleague? And if not, what targeted interventions would he make to tackle child hunger?
We are spending £1.6 billion a year on free school meals for children, and we do want to make sure that those that funding is targeted at the most needy, and that's precisely what is happening. We accept the point, and I agree with the Honourable Lady, that it is important that children from disadvantaged backgrounds, children that can't afford meals at lunchtime, that they are provided. But we are doing so. As I've said, we've increased the number of children eligible for free school meals, benefit-related free school meals, from 1.7 million to 1.9 million pupils.
Number
16, please, Mr Speaker.
Thursday.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Schools, like families and businesses across the world, are facing global inflationary pressures. The Prime Minister has pledged to halve inflation, and school funding will increase by £2 billion next year, as well as the year after that. This will be the highest real terms spending on schools in history, totalling £58.8 billion by 2024-25. In 2010, school funding stood at £35 billion, so we will be delivering a 68% increase in cash terms. The government's also announced further support for parents worth £26 billion next year.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. In addition to grave concerns about recruiting and retaining teachers, schools in Slough and across our country continue to struggle with their budgets, with a quarter of primary school senior leaders reporting that they have had to cut outings and trips due to budgetary constraints. So, Secretary of State, how will the government ensure that children do not miss out on these vital opportunities?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. The autumn statement announced a significant additional investment in core schools funding. The core schools budget will increase by £2 billion, as I've just pointed out, in 2023-24 and 24-25. That will be paid into schools' bank accounts in April, so I'm sure that they'll welcome that additional funding.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Department's own report now reclassifies... 17. Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 2 schools in Northumberland are prioritised for the school rebuilding programme, including Ringway Primary School in the Honourable Member's constituency. Schools were nominated by local authorities and trusts and selected according to the condition of their buildings following a robust assessment process. This is in addition to the £5.8 million of school condition allocation funding for Northumberland County Council in this financial year.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Department's own report now reclassifies a risk of school building collapsing as critical, very urgent. And despite the sterling efforts of head teachers and staff to keep school buildings in decent conditions, many children in my constituency are taught in buildings far below the standards they should expect. Can the Minister, despite what he's just said, can the Minister tell the House when adequate funding will be made readily available to bring all schools in my constituency up to scratch?
Well, we've allocated £13 billion since 2015 on school building and maintenance. In May 2022, for example, the government announced the outcome of the Condition Improvement Fund bids for 22-23. That will provide £500 million for 1,400 projects at 1,100 schools and sixth forms. The CIF is for individual schools and the groups of schools. In addition, £1.1 billion of school condition allocations was made to local authorities and large groups of academies. We take this issue very seriously. We want to make sure that all our schools are in the best possible condition for pupils to be able to learn.
Number 18, Mr Speaker.
My department has made a one-off reallocation of funding to add £15 million to this year's student premium, now worth £276 million. Universities can support disadvantaged students by drawing on the student premium and their own hardship funds. Many universities, like Newcastle and Northumbria, have allocated funds to support disadvantaged students.
Newcastle University Students' Union's recent cost of living crisis survey revealed that 41% of students have considered dropping out due to financial pressures. They're trying to balance studying with part and full-time jobs. They're increasingly isolated and exhausted. And the Student Union Food Bank, which is restocked daily, is emptied quickly, the record being within 7 minutes. Now, he knows that his additional hardship fund works out, I think, £10 per student, and they're leaving students £1,500 worse off because of the mismanagement of maintenance loans. So why are you punishing students like that?
Of course, I recognise that some students are facing hardships with the cost of living challenges, like many people up and down the the country. The £276 million is a lot of money that universities can draw on. As I mentioned, it's an increase of £15 million. Students in private accommodation can get a £400 rebate on their energy bills. We've frozen tuition fees for the past few years, and they'll have been frozen by 2024-25 for 7 years. We've increased maximum loans and grants by 2.8%, and if students' incomes fall below a certain level, they can reapply to get their loans looked at. And I really welcome that Newcastle University has increased the package of support available to students to more than £1.7 million.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The cost of living crisis we hear is serious for everyone, but for students in particular, they're facing real hardship. We've just heard the independent economists estimate that many students will be up to £1,500 worse off this year. Given the government's current focus on maths, can the Minister explain how his government calculated an increase of just 2.8% in the maintenance loan, following 2.3% this year, when the rolling average inflation rate is running at 9.3%?
I say to the honourable gentleman that we have to be fair to students and fair to the taxpayer as well. So we recognise student hardship. That's why we did increase the student premium to 276 million by 15 million pounds. Universities have their own hardship funds. I highlighted the 1.7 million given by Newcastle University. Other universities up and down the country are helping disadvantaged students. And I mentioned that students whose family incomes fall before certain levels can reapply to other student loans companies to get their loans reassessed.
Right, we come to Topical's Chum.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And special educational... Oh, number one, sorry.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, given this is my first education questions of 2023, I would like to wish you, the House, and all working in our education sector a Happy New Year and share some of what was to come from my department. Later this month, along with my honourable friend, the Children and Families Minister, I will be announcing our comprehensive plans to reform children's social care. Soon after, we will return to bring forward our transformational improvement plans to support children with special educational needs. In February, I hope members will join me in celebrating National Apprenticeship Week. And in April, our schools will have something to celebrate as they will be receiving their funding, which will include the extra £2 billion uplift announced at the Autumn Statement, seeing overall funding rise by 15% in just 2 years. We are investing more in our schools than ever before. By 2024-25, it will be £58.8 billion, the highest real-term spending in history.
Sean Wall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And special educational needs provision in school matters. I have so many parents contacting me because either they can't access it or it's inadequate. One family with 2 neurodiverse children suffering from bullying and self-harming found that their school's SEND policy did not even mention autism or neurodiversity. So this morning the Minister said that the response to the government's review would be published imminently. Can she confirm that that is within the month and that the clear standards that she measured will be, that she mentioned clear standards, can she confirm they'll be enforced?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and it is very important. Special educational needs is something I take very seriously, as does the Minister for Children, Families and Wellbeing. It will be very soon. There is not long to wait, and I'm sure that you will be delighted with the improvement plan that we will publish, which was very early in the new year, and not long to wait.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent, Hayley Turner, in our community of North Norfolk, is an inspirational campaigner for special educational needs. She improves it enormously across our whole area. The evidence shows that early diagnosis and indeed autism interventions is paramount to ensure that children get the help that they need, and Hayley now uses her experience to help many others in the community. Can I ask the Minister just what the government is doing to help with neurodevelopmental services and also to recruit education specialists?
Suggest that you do know it is a topic. We can't just go on and on. We've got to get through for everyone else's sake. Minister.
So I commend your constituent Hayley for the work that she does. I do think access to educational psychologists is paramount so you can get that early diagnosis, and we are funding an additional 600, 223, 400 in the year after.
Right, let's come to Show Secretary Bridget Phillips.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Department for Education has raised the risk of school buildings collapsing to critical very likely. And in December, the Schools Minister undertook to publish the data on these dangerous buildings by the end of the year. Yet parents, staff and pupils are still in the dark. When will the Secretary of State finally publish this data and own up to the extent of her own failure?
As we said, I said earlier, we're spending £13 billion on capital funding in the school system since 2015. We take the safety of schools very seriously. As I said, as the Secretary of State said earlier, regarding reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, we have written to all schools asking them to complete a questionnaire. In terms of publishing the data, the Department has already published summary findings from the condition data collection, and we plan to publish more detailed data shortly. The condition data collections help us to understand the condition of schools, and we will publish as and when the data is ready.
Second question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. No answer, even though the Schools Minister said we would see this data last year. Mr Speaker, Conservative members opposite have described their childcare policy as crazy, unnecessarily expensive, and that they should get on with reforming it. Mr Speaker, I agree. That's why the next Labour government will deliver a modern childcare system from the end of parental leave to the end of primary school. If even our own colleagues can see the case for change, why can't the Secretary of State?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady will find that when Labour were in power for 13 years, they did nothing on this issue. And actually, it was the Conservative government who expanded the 2-year-old offer and the 3- and 4-year-old offer for parents. And I would love to see the costings of her proposals, because I think what she's proposing is yet more pie in the sky for parents. But we take this issue very seriously, and we're very committed to increasing the flexibility and affordability of childcare for parents in this country.
Chloe Smith.
Mr Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State's brief update just now on the SEND Green Paper. It's right to get the correct support to families and to young people as early as possible. But the Green Paper was also right to talk about a truly inclusive education system. What progress will the 9,000 young people in Norfolk with education, health and care plans see in 2023?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady, and I hope that the 9,000 children will see progress. Not only have we increased the overall funding by about 50% for SEND since 2019, but we're increasing the number of specialist school places, and in the reforms that we're setting out, we'll be setting out national standards, which I hope will also improve their educational experience.
SNP spokesperson Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And as a former teacher, I support the right of our teachers to strike and will oppose this government's anti-strike legislation. So does the Secretary of State agree that constructive dialogue with our dedicated teachers is vital, rather than demonising them as Bolsheviks and commies, as one of her colleagues has disgracefully done?
I thank the Honourable Lady for a question. I always believe in constructive dialogue. The very first meeting I took as we welcomed in the new year was with all the 4 main teaching unions, and I will also be meeting them again later on this week.
Peter Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If we are levelling up and trying to recruit and train more teachers in the North East, why on earth has the outstanding Carmel College in my constituency been stripped of its accreditation to train teachers by a tick-box form-filling exercise, destroying 20 years of hard work and leaving the North East worse off?
Well, I visited Carmel College. I know what a good school it is. The ITT reforms are a key part of the government's commitment to levelling up and ensuring that high-quality teachers are there for every child. Following an expert review, a robust accreditation process was undertaken to approve 179 providers covering all regions, including the North East. And ICT provision is also expanding through the partnership. Now, I know my honourable friend discussed this with my predecessor, the honourable member for Stoke North, and I'd be happy to meet him again to discuss my honourable friend's concerns.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And myself and the member for Barnsley Central last week held a meeting with parents about SEND provision. Barnsley has one of the highest numbers of EHC plans in the country. What resources will the government commit to ensure provision is improved where it is needed most?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady, and I can tell her that the high needs funding for Barnsley increased 12% year on year for 2023-24, which will be over £40 million in total. They also received £7 million for high needs provision capital from 2023 to 2025 to increase the number of places as well.
Mr. Speaker, I remind the House of my members' entry. I'm glad to hear that the Children's Social Care Review response from the Government is going to come out shortly, and the Government has set up an implementation board to progress its findings. Over 80% of children in care are in the care of the independent sector, and yet that implementation board has refused to allow any representative from the independent sector on that board. Why not?
Thank my honourable friend for his question. I'm committed to reform in children's social care across all sectors, and my honourable friend, the Minister for Children, Families and Wellbeing, has been working hard in partnership with the National Implementation Board and the wider sector to design a plan for reform that will introduce meaningful change for children and families. It is quite a small group, so we've deliberately kept it small, but I'll ask my honourable friend to take a look and check that it's representative.
Speaker. The number of PE teachers has fallen by nearly 3,000 in the last 10 years, and the number of hours of PE taught fallen by 36,000. With nearly a third of young people currently classed as inactive, what's the government going to do to stop physical activity flatlining and make sure that young people can get the benefits, the social, physical, mental benefits of PE in schools?
Well, actually, we've met the target for PE teacher recruitment for most of the last 10 years. And we have the school sport and action plan in place. There's a new plan being worked on at the moment. We take sport in schools very seriously. It's important both for physical health and mental health, and actually for academic attainment.
Siobhan Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parents of children with special educational needs feel they are constantly battling to be heard, and so their children can lead fulfilling lives. Some Stroud children are only getting a few hours of schooling each week, which is hugely disruptive for family and child. So I'm working with Gloucestershire County Council's Phil Robinson to improve day-to-day experiences of Stroud families. But what is my right honourable friend doing to ensure that the local authorities and parents are really key to implementing the new reform?
Well, I thank my honourable lady. I am really exercised about this issue. I speak to parents of children with SEND all the time, and I do think they find the experience very adversarial. I'll be setting out more details in the implementation strategy shortly, but this is something that I care very passionately about.
Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The current National School Breakfast Programme only reaches 1/4 of the children living in areas with high levels of deprivation in England. Labour has set out our universal free breakfast offer, meaning no child is too hungry to learn. When will the government join the Labour Party in this commitment?
Well, we are spending £30 million between 2021 and 2024 on the school breakfast programme. It offers free breakfast to children in disadvantaged areas, supporting their attainment and readiness to learn. Now, the focus of the breakfast provision has been to target the most disadvantaged areas of the country, and that has been our strategy.
Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State think that it is acceptable that 4 out of 5 dyslexic children still leave school not identified, and that teachers still do not have to be trained to support dyslexic children specifically? It was a pleasure to meet the Minister last week, but will she ensure that in future early intervention is put in place for the identification of dyslexia and other neurodivergent conditions?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend and for his collaborative approach in the meeting that we had last week. I absolutely do think that early identification is key, and we'll be looking very carefully at that and teacher training in the implementation plan that I'll be setting out shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On New Year's Eve, the care community lost a highly respected and dear friend and true advocate. Ian Dixon spent his entire life making a difference to children in care and urging governments to listen to them. The care review does not have all the answers, so will the Minister please implement the recommendations from the pioneering Care Experience Conference, for which Ian played a leading role in?
Well, I thank my honourable lady, and I paid tribute to Ian's work, and I would love to look at that in more detail and speak to her further about what we can take forward.
Paul Holmes.
The latest for me was Chiltern Academy
and talking to them about their Go Well support. And we all talk about funding, but the biggest thing that they hit with me with on funding is not just the amount, but it's also the visibility and the extended timelines that it's there. Can the Minister please explain what can be done to make sure that the schools know earlier and for longer what money they'll have available?
Well, I understand and agree with my honourable friend about the importance of certainty over funding. The dedicated school grant allocations for 23-24 were published in December 2022, including indicative allocations for the mainstream schools additional grant, which will distribute the additional £2 billion of funding that was announced in the autumn statement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we've heard, the additional £15 million hardship for students announced last week amounts to less than £10 per head, significantly less according to my sums, while the IFS says that students are £1,500 a year worse off. Today, the APPG for Students is launching an inquiry into the impact of the cost of living crisis on students, inviting submissions from students, their unions and institutions across the UK. Will the Minister agree to meet with us to consider the evidence we receive?
Of course, I would be delighted to meet. 276 million, along with other measures the government done, including the energy rebates and other support that we try and give students who are facing cost of living challenges.
So,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In light of the government's new emphasis on numeracy in schools, can I make a plea that the government does not forget about literacy in schools, and in particular how we can continue to raise standards? I have an initiative called Get Whittam Reading, which has been running for 10 years now, and I would urge members of the front bench to come to Whittam to see that scheme in action this year, to see how it's raised standards in education.
Well, I couldn't agree more with my right honourable friend, and I share her passion. I'd be delighted to come and see the scheme in place in her constituency. We take reading very seriously. We have risen through the international league tables from joint 10th to joint 8th in the polls study, and it's the least able children who are improving fastest in those surveys.
Mike Hansbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. James Kerfoot, the head teacher of Ruddy Senior Academy, which serves constituents of my parish, has introduced free school meals for all pupils. Why doesn't the Minister do the same?
Well, as I said, we're spending £1.6 billion each year on free school meals, targeted at the most disadvantaged children. But of course, schools are able to use their pupil premium funding, which is £2.5 billion a year to schools, if they wish to extend the coverage of free school meals to more pupils. We did extend, as I've said earlier, free school meals to all pupils in infant schools, and that was an early decision of the coalition, the Conservative-led coalition government.
Jerome Bayu.
Mr. Speaker, children's services in Norfolk have been judged as requiring improvement all the way back since 2008. So will my honourable friend join me in congratulating Executive Director Sarah Tuff and all her staff, as well as Councillor John Fisher, on last week's assessment that Norfolk's children's services are now good and well on their way to outstanding?
I thank my honourable friend. I will indeed congratulate that team. It is actually quite a hard thing to do, and I think it's brilliant that they've been able to get to that recommendation.
Margaret Furrier.
Mr. Speaker, we take the safety of schools very seriously, the Minister's response to an earlier question. So, will Ministers reconsider mandating the fitting of sprinklers in new build schools to minimise the risk posed by fires to the buildings, equipment, pupils' schoolwork and the people within them?
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that there is revised guidance to the new Buildings Bulletin has been issued after a wide consultation, and it does make some changes to the requirement for when sprinklers are to be installed in schools, particularly when the risk factor of the pupils, the students in the school, is high. For example, children with special educational needs or residential schools.
Final question, Nicky Aitken.
Speaker, when I met with Jewish students studying in universities in my constituency, I was appalled to learn of the anti-Semitism that they have to suffer on a daily basis often. And it made worse by the recent report into the NUS, the National Union of Students, handling and challenging of anti-Semitism. In the month where we mark Holocaust Memorial Day, I would be interested to hear the Minister's assessment of that NUS report.
I thank my right honourable friend for her question. I've been shocked and sobered by reading this report that NUS was in essence a hostile place for Jewish students. That's not acceptable. NUS, National Union of Students, the main body for students, should be a place that isn't just safe, but a place that is welcoming for Jewish students as well. And the proof of the pudding of this report will be in the eating. I expect to see the changes and the recommendations implemented in full. And once that has occurred, then I will re-engage with the National Union of Students.
Right, that completes questions. We're now going to go on to the statement. I'll let the House clear. Let us come to the statement. I call the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I will make a statement on the execution of a British national in Iran. On Saturday morning, Iran's regime announced that it had executed Ali Reza Akbari, a British-Iranian dual national. I know that the thoughts of the whole House will be with his wife and 2 daughters at the time of their loss. They have shared his ordeal, an ordeal which began just over 3 years ago when he was lured back to Iran. He was detained and then subject to the notorious and arbitrary legal process of the regime. Before his death, Mr. Akbari described what was done to him and how torture had been used. Let there be no doubt, he fell victim to the political vendettas of a vicious regime. His execution was the cowardly and shameful act of a leadership which thinks nothing of using the death penalty as a political tool to silence dissent and settle internal scores. In February last year, Mr. Akbari's family asked the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for our support, and we have worked closely with them ever since. I want to pay tribute to their courage and their fortitude throughout this terrible period. In line with their wishes, my noble friend Lord Ahmed, the Minister of State, lobbied Iran's most senior diplomat in the UK as soon as we learned that Mr. Akbari's execution was imminent. We maintained the pressure right up until the point of his execution, but sadly to no avail. When we heard of the tragic news on Saturday morning, we acted immediately to demonstrate our revulsion. I ordered the summoning of Iran's Chargé d'Affaires to the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to make clear the strength of our feeling. Our ambassador in Tehran delivered the same message to a senior foreign ministry official. 10 other countries have publicly condemned the execution, including France, Germany, and the United States. The European Union has done the same, and I am grateful for their support at this time. We then imposed sanctions on Iran's Prosecutor General, Mohammad Jafar Montazeri, who bears heavy responsibility for the use of death penalty for political ends. His designation is the latest of over 40 sanctions imposed by the UK on the Iranian regime since October, including 6 individuals linked to the revolutionary courts, which have passed egregious sentences against protesters, including the death penalty. In addition, I have temporarily recalled His Majesty's Ambassador, Simon Shirtcliffe, from Tehran for consultations, and we met and discussed this earlier today. Now we should consider what further steps, alongside our allies, we take to counter the escalating threat from Iran. We do not limit ourselves to the steps that I have already announced. Mr. Akbari's execution follows decades of pitiless repression by a ruthless regime. Britain stands with the brave and dignified people of Iran as they demand their rights and freedoms. Just how much courage that takes is shown by the appalling fact that over 500 people have been killed and 18,000 have been arrested during a recent wave of protests. Instead of listening to the calls for change within Iran, the regime has resorted to its usual tactics of blaming outsiders and lashing out against its supposed enemies, including by detaining a growing number of foreign nationals for political gain. Today, there are many European nationals being held in Iranian prisons on spurious charges, including British dual nationals. And I pay tribute to our staff, both in Tehran and here in the UK who continue to work tirelessly on their behalf and to secure their release. And beyond its borders, the regime has supplied Russia with hundreds of armed drones used to kill civilians in Ukraine. Across the Middle East, Iran continues to inflict bloodshed and destruction by supporting extremist militias. And all the while, the steady expansion of the Iranian nuclear program is threatening international peace and security and the entire system of global non-proliferation. In the last 3 months alone, Britain has imposed 5 separate packages of sanctions on Iran, and today we enforce designations against over 300 Iranian individuals and entities. We have condemned the regime in every possible international forum, securing Iran's removal from the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, and alongside our partners, creating a new UN mechanism to investigate the regime's human rights violations during these recent protests. But the House should be in no doubt that we are witnessing the vengeful actions of a weakened and isolated regime, obsessed with suppressing its own people, debilitated by its own fear of losing power and wrecking its international reputation. Our message to that regime is clear. The world is watching you and you will be held to account, particularly by the brave Iranian people, so many of whom you are oppressing and killing. And I commend the statement to the House.
I now call Shadow Minister Bambas Charles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I also want to thank the Foreign Secretary for giving me advance sight of his statements. I'm responding on behalf of the opposition today as my right honourable friend, the member for Tottenham, is on a visit to Northern Ireland, so is unable to be here today. The execution of Ali Reza Akbari is the most horrendous human rights abuse, a barbaric act of politically motivated murder at the hands of the Iranian regime. The whole House's condolences and solidarity are with his family at a time of unimaginable grief. That the Iranian regime chose to take Mr. Akbari's life to make a political point to the British government is a disgrace. The death penalty should never be used for any crime, but in Iran we must call these executions what they are, a gross attempt to silence a protest movement by striking fear into the hearts of the ordinary Iranian people. In Mr. Akbari's case, this execution is a direct message to the British government. They are, in the words of Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, state-sanctioned killings. Mr. Akbari returned to Iran after a successful career in business in the UK to advise the government on the nuclear deal between the West and Iran. He wanted to see a successful deal to end the Western sanctions on the country. We have discussed many times in this House the importance of a strong response to this brutal regime. The government must now prescribe the IRGC, either through the existing process or through amending the National Security Bill, to create a new process of proscription for hostile state actors. The playbook of this regime is to use brutality and violence for its own political ends and its own survival. In his most recent threat update, MI5 Director Ken McCallum referred to 10 kidnap and death plots by the Iranian regime on British soil. When an organisation threatens the lives of British journalists and British Iranian activists in the UK, that organisation is a terrorist organisation. So I'd like to ask the Minister, when will he prescribe this heinous organisation and what actions he will take to protect the lives of British Iranians and in the UK and in Iran? And also, I hear what he said about the condemnation internationally, but what further conversations has he had with international partners to have a coordinated response to condemn and curtail the regime's appalling attack on the lives and human rights of its own people? Thank you.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman's comments on the solidarity that the whole House sends to the family of Mr. Akbari. He will know that the future prescription or sanctions designation of individuals or entities is not something that we speculate about or discuss at the dispatch box. However, he should know that we share the revulsion that he expressed at the dispatch box. As I said, we do not limit ourselves to the actions that we have already announced. and I have spoken with His Majesty's Ambassador for Tehran, and I will of course be speaking with other parts of government about what further action that we can take in response to the vile behaviour of the regime, and I can assure him that we speak regularly with our international friends on our collective response to Iran, both in the region and beyond, and we will continue to do so.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Katz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The thoughts of the entire Foreign Affairs Committee are with Mr Akbari's family. From hostage-taking to terrorist plots, assassinations, nuclear extortion, destabilisation of the Middle East and Europe, Iran is a terrorist state and they have weaponised human life. This is the first murder of a dual national since the 1980s, a clear escalation. So I make 4 asks. The House is clear that we do need to prescribe the IRGC. This is a policy decision, not a legal one. Can he confirm that he recognises that to be the case? Secondly, we need to close down the IRGC's operating centres within the UK, for example, that in Maida Vale. These are centres for spreading hostile influence within the UK. Can he also confirm that he will consider reactive sanctions to help the ordinary Iranians for whom no one else will stand up? After every state murder, we should impose sanctions to show that we will give their voice some support. And finally, can he reassure me that he is confident of the safety of our staff in Tehran? Because I remember the stories of my colleagues who were under siege from the Iranian state in the past, and I'm gravely concerned about their safety at this time.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend and the Chair of the Select Committee raises incredibly important points. She knows the long-standing convention about speculating about sanctions and prescriptions, but I absolutely take the points that she has made about ensuring that the response that we take here in the UK, and indeed the response that we take in conjunction with our international partners, sends an incredibly clear message to the regime that these actions are unacceptable and they will be responded to each and every time they take place. With regard to, as I say, the actions that we take domestically here within the UK, and I can assure her that we work closely with our Home Affairs colleagues on our collective response, and I agree with her that the safety of our team in Tehran is incredibly important. I pay tribute to the work that they do in incredibly challenging circumstances, and I also pay tribute to the demonstrations of international solidarity that we regularly receive from other platforms in Tehran.
SNP spokesperson Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I also thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. On behalf of the SNP, we utterly condemn the execution of Alireza Akbari in the strongest possible terms, and we extend our heartfelt condolences to his family. Once again, this execution highlights the serious injustice and failings of the Iranian judicial system. The Foreign Secretary's decision to sanction Iran's prosecutor is welcome. However, as we've been calling for many times, I would urge the Foreign Secretary again to go further and to prescribe to take forward the formal prescription of the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps as a terrorist organisation. So ask him again, will he commit to that? We remain deeply concerned about the safety of other arbitrarily detained UK Iranian nationals. Morad Tabaz, held for 5 years, Miran Rauf, held since 2020. Their families just want to see them come home safely. So what is the government doing about making that a reality? And does the Secretary of State know just how many dual UK Iranian nationals are currently detained in Iran, and can he tell us that number? The Foreign Office cannot make the same mistakes it's made in the past to other dual nationals such as Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe, Anousheh Ashuri and other UK Iranian nationals detained and, as we've heard, sometimes tortured. This shameful execution should serve as an urgent wake-up call, and these people and their families deserve better. What lessons has his government learned, and what are they going to do differently in future to support these people?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr Speaker, I can assure the honourable gentleman that we work tirelessly to support the release of British dual nationals held in detention in Iran, and our consular team support the families of those. The work that we do in Tehran, the work that our ambassador and his team do in Tehran is incredibly important. And it is to ensure, their presence there is to ensure that British dual nationals, whether they be in incarceration or not, are supported. And we will continue to work with our international friends and allies to secure the release of those the individuals. With regard to prescription, he does raise an important point. He will have heard the answers I've given to other colleagues, that we do not limit ourselves to the issue, to the responses we have already announced.
Dr. Matthew Otley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a terrible day when we see the execution of a British subject. In response to some broadcast media, that the decision by the Iranian regime to execute this individual came as a response to the repeated calls for prescription of the IRGC in a debate last week. In contrary, broadcast media not only gave an interview with his family, but also broadcast his comments about his torture by this vile regime. So does that show the Secretary of State, as it does to me, not only the power of the media broadcast, but also will he ensure that the funding of BBC Radio Persia will continue to ensure that the people of Iran can hear the truth, and that will one day oversee the downfall of this vile regime?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises an incredibly important point about our ability to project our values into Iran. The fact that millions of Iranians are protesting against their own government shows that there are many people in Iran who share our values and are deeply opposed to the regime that oppresses them. I have actually spoken with the BBC senior leadership about the funding of our foreign language world service broadcasts, including in Persia, the Persian broadcast, and I can assure him that whether it be through the BBC World Service or whether it be through the work that is done by our embassy, by the ambassador and his team, we will continue to project our values into Iran and hopefully reinforce and indeed show solidarity with those brave Iranians protesting against their own regime.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Akbari was my constituent, and I would like to offer my sympathies to his family here and abroad. I've been representing their interests in the past year, and I've had extensive contact in the past few difficult days. Their strength and courage have been extraordinary in the face of the brutality and cruelty of the Iranian regime. Earlier today, I spoke to Mr. Akbari's daughter in the UK, and she asked me to raise a further distressing matter with the Foreign Secretary. The regime refuses to release Mr. Akbari's body or to allow burial in the place chosen by him, and have made threats to destroy his body unless the family cooperates with their instructions. The cemetery where they were told he should be buried informed the family that burial already took place last week, casting doubt on the time of his execution. Will the Foreign Secretary meet with me and the family in the UK and do what His Majesty's government can to ensure that in death, if not in life, Mr. Akbari is treated with dignity and respect?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the points that the honourable gentleman has just raised, I'm sure, fill us all with revulsion. We will continue to support the family in whatever way we can, and he is absolutely right to call upon the regime to treat Mr. Akbari in death with the deference and respect that is legitimate. I will follow up on the points he made with our ambassador and communicate our incredible discomfort with the points he's just raised. And as I say, we'll continue to support the family in whichever ways we can.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, spoke very eloquently about the brutal hostility that the regime in Tehran is visiting, not only upon its own citizens, but on Ukraine in terms of its support for Russia and in neighbouring countries in the Middle East as well. And, of course, the execution of a UK passport holder. Does that not now mean we should be proscribing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and reviewing the UK's involvement in the Iran nuclear agreement.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises incredibly important points. We will continue to work with our friends and allies to ensure that Iran never acquires a nuclear weapon. With regard, as I say, to what further action we take, we do not limit ourselves to the announcements that we've just made. And part of the reason why I have temporarily recalled His Majesty's Ambassador to Tehran is so that we can discuss cross-government what our further response might be.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, this is Mr. Akbari's judicial murder is particularly poignant for us because he was a dual national, but all the murders that have been committed by the Iranian government over the last few days and weeks prove that they give a new meaning to the term criminal justice system, more criminal than justice. I do worry, however, that the Minister is always very reluctant to talk about further sanctions. Government ministers have invented this rule that they're not allowed to talk about them at the dispatch box just because it's a bit inconvenient for them. Isn't it time we actually had a proper parliamentary process for determining some of these? Because frankly, if it was up to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I suspect if it was up to this House, we'd have taken action 6 months ago and we wouldn't still be hanging around now.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman speaks with great passion on this, and I know he takes personal interest in the use of sanctions, and we have discussed this in terms of my appearances before the Select Committee. I think it's actually important that we maintain a clear distinction between the executive functions and the scrutiny functions, and whilst I understand there is a huge amount of embedded experience within the House, I think the job of government is to government, the job of this House is to scrutinise the government, and that's why that division of labour is important.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The execution of Alireza Akbari is a hideous act. It's very clear that the Iranian regime will do nothing to stop its desire to repress its people, whether that is arrest, torture, or indeed murder of its innocent citizens, many of whom are women. Many colleagues from across this House have called for the IGRC to be prescribed. I'd like to add my name to that list, and I would also urge the Foreign Secretary to continue to work with our allies to try and get a global consensus with our allies on this issue.
Foreign Secretary.
My right honourable friend highlights something I think we should all consider. The actions taken by the Iranian regime are a display of weakness and not strength. They live in fear of the voices of the Iranian people. That is why the regime is responding so brutally. And my advice to them, I have no doubt they won't take it, is to listen to their own people, to stop blaming external actors for actions stimulated by their oppression of their own people. And I can assure my right honourable friend that we will continue to work closely with our international friends and allies, so many of whom have expressed solidarity over the weekend in response to Mr Akbari's execution.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The execution of Alireza Akbari is horrendous, and if we ever wanted proof that we are dealing with barbarians, it is this and what's happened over the last few months. I urge the Foreign Secretary, whilst he is considering prescription and the harshest possible sanctions, and I would like to add the voices of the Liberal Democrats to that and offer our support, to consider another move. We've learned from the Ukraine war that actually if you go after individuals and the spoils of their human rights abuses, that is one very effective way to also sanction. I ask him, what consideration has the government given to doing an audit of any assets from those we have sanctioned, but particularly from those family members who may be resident here in the UK? And can he assure this House that there isn't a single penny of their spoils that is sloshing around the British economy?
Foreign Secretary.
Mr Speaker, we will of course always examine ways of ensuring that our sanctions are most effective and have the deterrent effect as well as the punitive effect that they are designed to have. And I can assure the Honourable Lady that we will continue working closely with, as I say, our friends and allies internationally who share our revulsion at the actions of the Iranian regime. She describes the regime as a barbarian. I think one of the great ironies is that Iran has a long history, a multi-millennial history of sophistication and thoughtfulness. And that history, that reputation, is being destroyed on a daily basis by the people who are currently holding the levers of power in Tehran. I think that is a massive shame for the Iranian people more broadly.
Bob Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for his statement and indeed express my sympathy to the family of Mr Akbari, who are going through such terrible times at the moment. We should remember, however, that Iran is the second highest carrying out of executions anywhere in the world.
Yep.
Second only to China.
Yep.
So this is not something that is isolated. This is something the regime implement. Can I commend my honourable friend to read the debate in Hansard that we held last Thursday, where more than 30 contributions from across the House gave excellent examples of what is going on in Iran. He can negotiate with our allies to impose sanctions against Iran totally, which will isolate the regime. He could also talk to the Home Secretary about prescription of the IRGC. That is the settled view of this House. So he has the support of the House on all sides, on all parties. Surely that must be enough to actually prescribe the IRGC in its entirety and sequestrate their assets for once and for all.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend, I think, is right to pay tribute to the strong and clear stance that this House has taken in response to the brutality meted out by the Iranian regime, and I can assure him and the House that we will continue to work cross-government department and internationally and the most effective ways of curtailing Iran's malign activity both within Iran, within the region and globally.
Kim Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'd like to send my sincere condolences to the family and loved ones of Mr Akbari. The use of the death penalty is appalling under all circumstances, are the practices of torture and prolonged solitary confinement, all of which Mr Akbari was subjected to while being held by the Iranian authorities. Amnesty has called for the UK government to work with international bodies to fully investigate Mr Akbari's allegations of torture and all other ill treatment, and to pursue the criminal investigation of officials reasonably suspected of involvement in crimes under international law. Will the Minister agree today to take up these calls for justice?
Foreign Secretary.
I can assure the honourable lady that we will not rest until this regime is held to account for the brutality and atrocities that they have meted out to their own people, and we will do so in close cooperation with our friends in the international community.
Caroline.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Southampton has a significant Anglo-Iranian community, and many of them have made the point to me that this is a regime that can only maintain its position through terror and torture. But they are scared. They are scared for their family members, they are scared for women, they are scared for dual nationals, they are scared for students. And they want to see the prescription of the IRGC, and they want me to leave my right honourable friend in no doubt that Anglo-Iranians in this country wish to see our government do more.
Foreign Secretary.
I can assure the right honourable lady that we will continue working cross-department, across Whitehall, to make sure that those Iranians who have chosen to make the UK their home, those Anglo-Iranians who live here in the UK, feel safe. It is the first duty of government to protect the people within these shores, and I can assure her we take that responsibility incredibly seriously.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for what he has said about the brutal murder of Mr Akbari. The sad truth, however, is that the Iranian regime does these things because it can. There are voices who have called for the JCPOA process to be abandoned. I'd be very grateful if the right honourable gentleman could tell the House what his current view is. Can I caution him that in the absence of that, what other means would we have of preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, which, given their current behaviour, is surely unthinkable?
Mr Speaker, the right honourable gentleman makes an incredibly important point. We hear calls from Tehran for us to lift sanctions. We remind them that these sanctions are imposed because of their behaviour, whether it be violations of human rights, whether it be brutality against their own people, whether it be the support of militias in the region, or indeed because of their attempts to acquire a nuclear weapon. We will continue to work closely with our international partners in preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And negotiations on the JCPOA have not progressed. The ball is very much in the court of the Iranians. And what I would say very strongly to them is that the world will continue to work in concert and solidarity to prevent them acquiring a nuclear weapon. And if they wish sanctions to be lifted, the regime has to fundamentally change its behaviours.
John Whittington.
My honourable friend, the member for Hendon, was right to draw attention to the power of the media in exposing what is going on in Iran. But my right honourable friend will be aware of the continuing threats against journalists working for Iran International, whose headquarters in Chiswick is under permanent armed police guard. Will he make clear to the Iranian regime that threats on British soil of this kind against journalists are utterly unacceptable, and will he consider extending the sanctions against anyone in the Iranian regime responsible for making threats against journalists?
Foreign Secretary.
My right honourable friend echoes the point that the Iranian regime is fearful of criticism, and it is particularly fearful of criticism from within Iran itself and from Iranians internationally. That's why they behave so petulantly and aggressively towards journalists, and that's why we have an incredibly important responsibility to protect those journalists, to support those dissenting voices, and I can give him the assurance on behalf of my colleagues in the Home Office and Security Services that we will continue to support the free expression of those brave Iranian voices that are criticising a regime which currently has a stranglehold around their country.
No,
yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my heart goes out to the family and friends of Mr. Akbari. This Iranian regime is using the death penalty as a tool of political repression against courageous protesters. This IRGC regime also threatens, as we've heard, the lives of journalists and British Iranian activists here in the UK. We did see cross-party support here last week for prescribing the IRGC. So I will ask the Secretary of State again, if he will answer this time, will the UK government take action and urgently brand the IRGC as a terrorist organisation?
Foreign Secretary.
The Honourable Lady is right to raise the need to respond to the actions that have been taken by the Iranian regime. As I say, I've announced an initial set of responses immediately after the execution of Mr. Akbari, and as I've said to the House, we will work. I will listen. I am consulting with HMA Tehran today. I have done today, and we'll work cross-government to ensure that our response to Iran is robust and deters further actions of this kind.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Right Honourable Friend for his excellent statement. But can my Right Honourable Friend confirm that he will be discussing the execution of Mr. Akbari on his visit to Washington this week, and assure us that he will be seeking to coordinate the strongest response with our allies in response to this latest state-sponsored torture and killing, as well as Iran's escalating human rights abuses against women and wider security threat?
Foreign Secretary.
I can assure my honourable friend that our response to the Iranian regime in general and the response to this execution in particular will be one of those things that I address with both my American and Canadian counterparts when I visit those two countries later on this week. And I can assure her and indeed the House that those messages of solidarity that we've received from our international partners reflect the strength of feeling that I receive in conversations when I have them about this issue.
Mr. Speaker, the vile Iranian regime is operating through proxies in this country. My honourable friend for Hampstead and Kilburn and I have been working closely with the police in respect of the Islamic Community Centre in Maida Vale and the weekly counter-protests that are now occurring there. These are causing very real concern in this residential community. Can the Secretary of State tell us what investigations he is carrying out into the operation of these centres and how they can be managed to protect local communities, including the very diverse Muslim communities in that area?
Secretary.
The Honourable Lady will understand, of course, that actions that happen here in the UK are the responsibility of the Home Office, but I can assure her that my department and that department work closely on these issues, and we will continue to do so in relation to the issue that she's raised.
Bring on.
Whether or not I sign confession papers, they will kill me. My only wish is to see my daughter one last time. After 10 years, God finally gave us a child. I only got to see her for 18 days before being arrested for protesting. I miss my daughter so much. My only wish is to get to see my daughter one last time before they kill me. Those are the words of Hassan Firouzi, another citizen who has been condemned to death and who, at the urging of a close Iranian friend in my constituency, I have adopted his case. Does the Foreign Secretary believe that it is helpful for members of Parliament to adopt individual people who are on death row in Iran, to publicise their case and to put maximum pressure on the regime?
Mr. Speaker, I'm genuinely grateful for the honourable gentleman's raising of this particular case. I know the Iranian regime hates it when their actions are called out on the international stage. I have made it clear to the Iranians that if they want the criticism to stop, their behaviour must change. The behaviour at the moment deserves criticism in this chamber and indeed internationally. And I commend all colleagues where they have the opportunity to raise the cases, to demonstrate to the brave Iranians who are standing up against the brutality of their own government that we show solidarity with them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I add my condolences to others for the family of Mr. Akbari at this very sad time, and I cannot see why the Secretary of State is delaying in prescribing the regime in Iran and call on him to do so immediately. But in my human rights city of York, we have serious concern about the use of the death penalty. Over 20,000 people on death row across over 55 jurisdictions right now. So will he lead a discussion within the UN to bring the use of state-authorised death to an end across the world? Because when it is condoned in one country, it gives Iran more liberty to apply it in its own.
Foreign Secretary.
The Honourable Lady, I'm sure, will know that the UK opposes death penalty in all respects. We have communicated this internationally and we have communicated this to the Iranian regime. Our position on this is long-standing, it is principled, it will not change, and we will highlight this opposition to the death penalty whenever we have the opportunity to do so.
Margaret Farrell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement, and I know that Lord Ahmed would have done everything in his power to stop this despicable act. I condemn the execution of Mr. Akbari, a British-Iranian dual national, and I want to place in record my condolences to his wife and 2 daughters. Does the Foreign Secretary have concerns that ending the talks on the nuclear deal in the face of ongoing turmoil in the country could see Iran speed up its uranium enrichment programme or pull out of the treaty altogether?
Mr. Speaker, the international community, the signatories to the JCPOA, have given the opportunity to the Iranian regime to make changes. They have thus far failed to grasp the opportunity presented to them. We will continue working to prevent them acquiring a nuclear weapon, but the ball ultimately is in their court. If they want sanctions lifted, they have to change, fundamentally change their behaviour.
Right, that completes the statement. I'll just let people clear before we start the next one. Right, I call the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker, and can I just start by apologising for the way the information that is contained in the statement has come out in the media. It doesn't do me any favours, nor does it make my job any easier. So I apologise to Mr. Speaker and to the House. It is certainly not my doing, and I think it doesn't help us in furthering the policy. Mr. Speaker, it's been a month since I last updated the House on the situation in Ukraine. Over the last 4 weeks, extremely heavy and attritional fighting has continued, especially around the Donetsk Oblast town of Bakhmut and in the less reported on sector of Crimea in Luhansk. Over Christmas, Russia has continued its assault on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. But no matter how cruel or how much loss of life accompanies it, Russia has singularly failed to break the will of the Ukrainian people or change the policy of its leaders. We continue to closely monitor how Russia's long-range strike campaign will evolve as it eats deeper into the strategic reserves of its own modern missiles. It is notable that Russia are now using the forced labour of convicts to manufacture weaponry. Ukraine, however, continues using its internationally provided long-range artillery to successful effect. Mr. Speaker, throughout the war, Russia has managed to lose significant numbers of generals and commanding officers. But last week's announcement that their commander in Ukraine, General Sergei Surovikin, had been unceremoniously bypassed with Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, personally taking over field command is certainly significant. It is the visible tip of an iceberg of factionalism within the Russian command. Putin apparently remains bullish, and with Gerasimov's deference to the president never in doubt, we now would expect a trend back towards a Russian offensive, no matter how much loss of life accompanies it. Mr. Speaker, in 2023, there is no loss of momentum from the international community, quite the opposite. President Putin believed the West would get tired, bored, and fragment. Ukraine is continuing to fight, and far from fragmenting, the West is accelerating its efforts. The United States has invested approximately $24.2 billion in support for Ukraine since the beginning of Russia's invasion on the 24th of February last year. It has delivered thousands of anti-aircraft and anti-armour systems and has recently stepped up that support, delivering Patriot air defence battery munitions and 45 refurbished T-72 Bravo tanks, as well as donating 50 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles to assist with the counter-offensive. We also welcome the decision of the French government to provide Ukraine with the AMX-10 light, highly mobile tank. And this has been used very recently in reconnaissance missions by the French army and was deployed as recently as the Barkhane mission in West Africa. Mr. Speaker, important as these contributions are in and of themselves, what matters more is they represent part of an international effort that collectively conveys a force multiplier effect. None of this is happening unilaterally. No one is doing this on their own. Soon I shall be announcing the first round of bids to the joint chaired Danish-UK International Fund for Ukraine, and I'm grateful for Sweden over the festive period for adding to the pot of money donated. That now includes Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, Iceland, Lithuania, and others have donated to that fund. Meanwhile, Russia, isolated without such support, has now lost over 1,600 main battle tanks in Ukraine since the start of the invasion. But if we're to continue helping Ukraine seize the upper hand in the next phase of conflict, we must accelerate our collective efforts diplomatically, economically, and militarily to keep the pressure on Putin. In December, I told the House that I was developing options to respond to Russia's continued aggression in a calibrated and determined manner. Today, I can announce the most significant package of combat power to date to accelerate Ukrainian success. This includes a squadron of Challenger 2 tanks with armoured recovery and repair vehicles. We will donate AS-90 guns to Ukraine. This comprises a battery of 8 guns at high readiness and 2 further batteries at varying states of readiness. This donation will not impact our existing AS-90 commitment in
Estonia. Hundreds more armoured and protected vehicles will also be sent, including Bulldog. A manoeuvre support package, including minefield breaching and bridging capabilities, worth £28 million, and dozens more uncrewed aerial systems, worth £20 million, to support Ukrainian artillery. Another 100,000 artillery rounds on top of 100,000 rounds already delivered. Hundreds more sophisticated missiles, including GMLRS rockets, Starstreak air defence, and medium-range air defence missiles. An equipment support package of spares to refurbish up to 100 Ukrainian tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. While the tanks and the AS-90s will come from our stocks, along with their associated ammunition, a significant number of the other donations are being purchased from the open market or from supportive third-party countries. Today's package is an important increase to Ukraine's capabilities. It means they can go from existing to expelling Russian forces from Ukrainian soil. President Putin cannot win, but he is equally certain he can continue inflicting this wanton violence and human suffering until his forces are ejected from their defensive positions and expelled from the country. That requires a new level of support, the combat power only achieved by combinations of main battle tank squadrons operating alongside divisional artillery groups and further deep precision fires, enabling targeting of Russian logistics and command nodes at greater distance. Mr. Speaker, we will be the first country to donate Western main battle tanks, and we will be bringing a further squadron of our own Challenger tanks to higher readiness in place of the squadron sent. Even as we gift Challenger 2 tanks, I shall at the same time be reviewing the number of Challenger 3 conversions to consider whether the lessons of Ukraine suggest that we need a larger tank fleet. We will also build on the Army's modernisation programme at pace, specifically on artillery. I am accelerating the mobile fires programme, so instead of delivering in the 2030s, it will do this earlier this decade. I've also directed that, subject to commercial negotiation, an interim artillery capability is to be delivered. After discussion with the United States and our European allies, it is hoped that the example set by the French and us will allow those countries holding Leopard tanks to donate as well. I know there are a number of countries wanting to do the same. No one is going it alone, Mr. Speaker, as I have said. Mr. Speaker, it's worth reiterating why we are doing this. Because in 2023, the international community will not let Russia wait us out while inflicting terrible suffering on Ukrainian civilians. The international community recognises that equipping Ukraine to push Russia out of its territory is as important as equipping them to defend them what they already have. This week, dozens of nations will meet in Ramstein, Germany, to progress further donations and international coordination. The Kremlin will be in no doubt that we are resolved to stand by Ukraine in her fight. Doubling down on the success of our basic training for Ukrainian military in 2022 in the United Kingdom, we are also now increasing this number this year to a further 20,000. Canada, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, Lithuania, New Zealand and the Netherlands have already joined this effort, and I'm pleased to say we are now going to be joined by a group of Australian military to train in this country as well, leaving their summer to join our winter, brave souls. Our decision today is a calibrated response to Russia's growing aggression and indiscriminate bombing. The Kremlin must recognise that it is their behaviour that is solidifying the international resolve, and that despite the propaganda, Ukraine and her partners are focused on the defence of Ukraine. None of the international support is an attack on Russia or NATO-orchestrated aggression, let alone a proxy war. At its heart, it is about helping Ukraine defend itself, upholding international law and restoring that country's sovereignty. We believe that in 2023, increased supplies, improved training and strengthening diplomatic resolve will enable Ukraine to be successful against Russia's poorly led and now badly equipped armed forces. From the outset, President Putin believed his forces would be welcomed with open arms, that Ukrainians wouldn't fight and that Western support would crumble. He has been proved wrong on all counts. Today's package will help accelerate the conclusion of Putin's occupation and all its brutality, and ensure that in 2023 and beyond if necessary, Ukraine retains its momentum, supported by an international community that is determined more than ever that Putin's illegal and unprovoked invasion will fail. Thank you.
Senate Secretary of State John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Defence Secretary's statement and thank him for advance sight of it. 2023 will indeed be the decisive year in this war in Ukraine, and the most decisive moment is now. Now, when Ukraine has the tactical and morale advantage over Russia, now when Ukraine needs more combined military firepower to break the battlefield deadlock. As the NATO Secretary-General said yesterday, it is important that we provide Ukraine with the weapons it needs to win. That's why this first package of UK military assistance for 2023, with tanks, artillery, infantry vehicles, ammunition and missiles, has Labour's fullest support. Challenger 2 is a world-class tank, and it can help Ukraine retake lost ground and limit the cost in Ukrainian lives. So we're now sending 14. How many tanks does Ukraine need for a successful counter-offensive? Are the 14 Challengers currently in active service or in storage? When will they be delivered into the field in Ukraine? What combat engineering vehicles will be delivered to support these tanks? Will any UK forces personnel be deployed into Ukraine with these vehicles? And the integrated review cut Challenger tanks from 227 to 148. So I welcome the Defence Secretary's review of Challenger 3 numbers. When will he announce the results of this review? And is he reviewing other army cuts? Now, Mr. Speaker, the Armed Forces Minister told me in a parliamentary answer last week that Challenger 2 training takes 33 days for gunners, 46 days for drivers and 85 days for crew commanders. The Defence Secretary made no mention this afternoon of Challenger training. Will the UK provide training alongside the tanks? And how long will the training for Ukrainian troops be? Mr. Speaker, President Zelensky has confirmed the wider importance of this UK military package, saying at the weekend, this will not only strengthen us on the battlefield, he said, but also send the right signal to other partners. And the Defence Secretary today said he hopes that this UK military aid will help unlock more coordinated support from other nations. So I, like him, welcome similar moves already announced by other NATO nations in recent days, particularly the US and France. But can I ask him, how many of the 14 Leopard-using nations may provide these tanks now to Ukraine? What more does he expect from allies at the Ramstein meeting on Friday? And it's been 5 months now since he announced the international fund. When indeed will allocations be made? Now, the Prime Minister has talked at the weekend about seeing a surge in global military support for Ukraine. How's the Defence Secretary going to ensure a continuing surge in the UK military support? What more can Ukraine expect from the UK? Because, Mr. Speaker, you know, and the Defence Secretary knows, I've argued for months that ministers must move beyond ad hoc announcements and set out a full 2023 action plan for military, economic and diplomatic support, a case the Defence Secretary has fully accepted, because this will help give Ukraine confidence in future supplies, it'll help gear up our own industry, it'll encourage allies to do more, and it will make clear that things will get worse, not better, for Russia. So, Mr. Speaker, one of the clear lessons from the last year in Ukraine is that nations need to have large reserve stocks of certain weapons and ammunition, or the ability to produce them quickly. The UK has neither. And we are still moving too slowly to replace the weapons donated to Ukraine or find new wartime ways of making weapons more rapidly and more cheaply. Now, there was no mention in the Secretary of State's statement this afternoon about replenishing UK stockpiles or a new industry plan. Can he update the House on the action he's taking. And finally, Mr. Speaker, and importantly, he said today's military package means Ukraine can go from resisting to expelling Russian forces from Ukrainian soil. Will he confirm that this now is the UK's strategic aim for Ukraine?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if you indulge me, there's lots of questions, and I will do my best to answer them all. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member and for his party's support, which, as he said, has been ongoing and enduring throughout this whole process. And I believe it's what allows the UK to be prominent in standing tall for international human rights and defending Ukraine. He asks, the Right Honourable Member asks what level of support Ukraine will need, such as in scale, and if he will indulge me, I can't be too specific, otherwise I don't want to set out to our Russian government exactly the inadequacies or strengths of the Ukrainian armed forces, but it is safe to say that the Ukrainians will require an ongoing commitment that grows to the size of divisions in its armed forces, but also in the last, obviously, year nearly, what we have seen is Ukraine grow its own army to have significantly hundreds of thousands of men and women under arms, now equipped not only with Western equipment, but also captured or refurbished former Soviet or Russian equipment. The Polish government themselves have donated over 200 T-72 tanks, for example. So the key here for all of us is that in the next phase, to make sure we help them train and combine all of those weapon systems in a way that can deliver a combined arms effect in a mobile manner to deliver an offensive that is required, or offences that are required to achieve the goal of expelling. And I'll come to his final point in that it is the UK's government position that Putin's invasion fails and that Ukraine restores its sovereign territory, and we will do all we can do to help achieve that, and that is this package is part of that. And if I was to say that obviously the challenges should be viewed alongside the 50 Bradleys from the United States, that those are the ingredients effectively of your battle group with divisional level fires of either AS-90s or other 155 howitzers. The 14 tanks that represents a squadron, and indeed 50 Bradleys would be roughly an armoured infantry battle group. So what we're trying to do is, in the next step, take a Ukrainian military whose history has been in Soviet methods, and not only have we provided them with Western equipment, but also Western know-how. And the training will be delivered, first of all, in answer to the question, almost immediately. It will start with Ukrainians, both in the UK, but also training in the field, so to speak, in either neighbouring countries or in countries such as Germany, where we saw the artillery train with the Dutch, I think, at the beginning of this process. So training will be administered, supported both in the UK and elsewhere in Europe to these Ukrainian forces, with the US being in the lead of much of that formation training, which is incredibly important and supportive of the United States to do so. There'll be no UK forces deployed in this process in Ukraine, and as I've said earlier, that is because our job is to help Ukraine defend itself, and we can do that from neighbouring or other countries. Yes, I know the training cycle. I once was a trooper on the Scots Dragoon Guards in 1988, and I think I started my time in a chieftain tank, which I think you'll be lucky to see in a museum these days. But nevertheless, I think what the Ukrainians have showed us, even in their basic and other specialist training, is when you are determined and you're wanting to go back and fight for your country, their work ethos, their hours they put in is quite extraordinary. And I'm very confident that in one level they'll soon be showing us the way in how to fight this equipment. He references one of the army cuts. Look, I've come to this dispatch on numerous occasions and admitted how woeful our army's equipment programmes have been in the past and how behind and out of date they have been, which is why we've committed over £24 billion of investment into their equipment, the army's equipment alone, over the next 10 years. Deep fires, I've said I'm bringing forward, Recce, getting Ajax back on track, ISR capability, tanks, Challenger 3, and indeed the Boxer fleet, plus many other investments into the army. It is incredibly important. I take it seriously, and I know the Right Honourable Gentleman does too, and we have to deliver an army that can stand shoulder to shoulder with its peers, never mind its enemy, and I think that is important to say so. On the area of the Leopard coalition, I think as they're calling themselves, it has been reported that obviously Poland is very keen to donate some Leopard, as is Finland, who have expressed. All of this currently relies on the German government's decisions, not only whether the Germans will supply their own Leopards, but whether or not they'll give permissions for others. I would urge my German colleagues to do that. These tanks are not offensive when they are used for defensive methods. You know, there's a debate in Germany at the moment about whether a tank is an offensive weapon or a defensive weapon. Well, depends what you're using it for. If you're using it to defend your country, I would wager that it is a defensive weapon system. Secondly, we are not on our own. This is a joint international coalition, and I know there's been concerns in the German political body that they don't want to go alone. Well, they're not alone, and I think the conference in Ramstein will show that. And the French, you know, I pay tribute to the French's commitment to put in those tanks at Christmas time, and you know, we are obviously joining alongside them. So I think, but they are the key to unlocking the Leopard. We'll do all we can to help that. On the International Fund, the answer is imminently, and when I mean imminently, next couple of weeks, I shall announce it. We had $27 billion worth of bids, I think, for a fund that's reached 500 million. And as I said, I'm very grateful for the Swedish donation very recently towards that fund. And we intend to keep growing it. But I want to make sure that the fund is spent in a sustainable way. It's not a petty cash or a cash fund, or a slush fund where you just go and buy something. I want it invested in things like production and supply chains, because what is going to be key is whether you're maintaining tanks or artillery supplies, you need an active production line. And that goes to his very last point, Madam Deputy Speaker, which was being too slow to place orders. One of the reasons it has taken time to place orders, as he knows, is there is no supply chain sometimes. And you have to wait for the supply chain to be either reinvested in or redeveloped or indeed found again, new suppliers, before you'll even get a price for the taxpayer or indeed a contract delivered. And that's what happened with the NLAW. As much as we would love to have placed the order on the next day, some of that supply chain was 15 years old and had to find some new suppliers. Then we got a price, then we got some partners, Sweden and us, placed an order, and by doing so we managed to reinvigorate that supply chain and hopefully more jobs with it. Thank you.
Select Committee, Tobias Owen.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. This conflict is not going to end anytime soon. Putin is moving his country to a war footing, preparing for a spring offensive. So tactically speaking, finally seeing some serious NATO standard tracked hardware being gifted to Ukraine is very much welcome indeed. And it's another example of the UK leading, ever pushing the envelope of international support for Ukraine. But as other nations follow our lead, maintaining so many NATO variants of vehicles and equipment, of tanks, APCs, artillery pieces as well, is not practical in the long term. Could the UK consider leading again by establishing a Western-funded, Ukrainian-operated weapons factory and assembly line in eastern Poland, so Ukraine can become self-sufficient in procuring and replenishing the military kit and munitions it needs for its own long-term security without fear of the facility being targeted by Russia?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and his suggestion is absolutely correct. He is also right to make at the point that for all of this gifting, unless there is a supply chain or indeed sustainability package behind it, then when these vehicles run out, or indeed in the case of artillery, the barrels are worn out, they'll just become junk on the battlefield. And it's really important that we think that way. And that's why with the Challenger 2 donations, we'll be putting in some recovery vehicles with them. And there's a lot of thought going on right now about exactly sustainability of that supply chain. And that slightly ties into the International Fund. I'm looking for an intelligent application for that fund to stimulate just that. On his point about Ukraine itself, Ukraine has shown itself to be incredibly successful at either reverse engineering what they've captured from Russia or indeed designing and developing their own. They had opened a production line of 155 shells, I think, recently, or 152, and they're now manufacturing within their own country. But I will also say that we're going to get to the same way he wants to, which is I'll use things like the International Fund or Kindred in order to fund those supply chains over the border. And if Ukraine approaches us with ideas for transferring the IP for us to make it for them, or for them to make it here or anywhere else, I'll be very open to doing that.
SNP spokesperson Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the detail and the substance of the Secretary of State's statement, and I believe, moreover, that the timing is very welcome, closing in as we are on the first anniversary of the outrageous attack on Ukraine by Putin and his forces last February. We must, all of us, regardless of our political allegiances or differences in other areas of politics, stand up for the international rules-based system, the rights of sovereignty and the values of self-determination where these are under attack. Not simply at the outset of conflict, Madam Deputy Speaker, when hackles are raised and outrage peaked, but now, as we endure almost a year of the effects of this conflict on these shores, in our homes, in our industry and wider resources, as we continue to witness Russia's hybrid terror heaped upon the people of Ukraine. Now is the time to double down on the West's support and commitment to Ukraine to defend herself against this aggression, and time to leave Putin in no doubt that the West's resolve, politically and in every other respect, is there for Ukraine to see this the distance. I'd like to know three things, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State said on the 12th of December that he wouldn't pursue sending redundant UK Warrior infantry fighting vehicles to Ukraine due to it being a tracked vehicle weighing 28 tonnes and the logistical tail that comes with these vehicles. So what has changed in a month to allow him now to send a squadron of 68-tonne Challenger tanks with a very much more complex logistics and support burden to go along with them? Can the Secretary of State also set out what the duration between this announcement and these Challenger 2s having operational effect within the Ukraine battle space? And given that European and NATO nations must doubtless follow this development with similar donations of Leopard 2 tanks, is the Secretary of State prepared not just to review the numbers of Challenger 3, but whether Challenger 3 will be the right solution for the UK going forward at all? When we see Challenger and Leopard 2 going toe-to-toe with the same peer adversary, we'll see very much clearer then which is the better tank.
Secretary of State.
Look, I'm always happy to keep under review the number of tanks and what we have. One of the lessons of Ukraine is, however, that modern or not so modern tank, unless it's properly protected, supported either by counter-drone capability, electronic warfare, or indeed a proper wrap, then it can become incredibly vulnerable. It can go from the lion on the savannah to suddenly a very vulnerable thing. And so when you look at the finite amount of money we would all have in government, how much do you make a perfectly formed battle group, or how much do you take a risk? The Russians took a risk on the road to Kyiv, and that is where we are. But the difference between the Warrior and the Challenger obviously is a different vehicle. But secondly, as I referenced earlier, the 50 Bradley, the United States vehicles, are in a better probably condition than our Warriors. But secondly, these Challengers are designed to complement those, and hopefully we will be training together with the Challenger and the Bradley and to interoperate. Secondly, there are issues with the Warrior fleet. Obviously, I'm happy to constantly look at that. I won't rule it out. But for now, taking 12 tanks as opposed to what would probably have to be 40-odd Warrior to make it a sort of company-sized level, I think I would prefer to focus on the AS-90s and indeed the Challenger tanks to make that difference.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I welcome the statement from my right honourable friend? Can I say it with the member for Bradford South? I had the privilege just before Christmas of working south of Kharkiv with a British charity, the Siobhan's Trust, feeding thousands of dispossessed Ukrainians. But while there, I was able to talk to a lot of the Iranian military. Two things. I want to congratulate my right honourable friend, because the one thing they were saying was they were very, very disappointed in Germany's failure to give permission for the Leopard tanks to be sent to them as originally arranged, and they now believe that, of course, this decision by Her Majesty's government will help unlock that. The second point was that though I visited the military hospital in Kharkiv, which is shelled, by the way, 2 or 3 times a week, devastation is appalling, but they did ask me for some things that are not offensive ones. Number one, they really desperately need more armoured ambulances, because they say that the experience is terrible about them getting the wounded quickly back to the hospitals. Number two was that they have a very great shortage of paramedics, and they need that very much as well. And the third area they were keen on, and this is something that's shocking, is that the number of Ukrainian military committing suicide now as a result of battlefield stress is astonishing, and they desperately need help. And they did ask that the US and the UK, who have experience in Afghanistan, Iraq, etc., could help by sending some people over to help train in those mental health practices. It would be really helpful.
Secretary of State.
Can I thank my right honourable friend, and I'll be fascinated to follow up with him his experience with Sean's Trust. I think it's easy to forget that there are lots and lots of Ukrainians suffering either post-conflict through the suicide or indeed just ordinary individuals. And you know, the tragedy is 9 months, 10 months in, people get slightly immune to what they see on the media and the telly and social media from what is really violence and destruction of a staggering scale. My right honourable friend, the Minister for Personnel and Veterans, has just said to me that the Surgeon General is going to visit soon to see what more we can do to help those individuals, especially suffering from the acute mental health challenges they have. On armoured ambulances, I know there's been some donations already, some of which has been also done by private donations. I think a colleague of ours in this House, Madam Speaker, from Yorkshire, approached me about a company that I think had donated some armoured ambulances. In the announcement, I noticed we've sent some bulldogs for people as old as me. That's actually called a 432. I think they gave it a new coat of paint and called it a bulldog, but fundamentally they have ambulance variants, so I'll see if they are included in that as well. I can write to the honourable gentleman with the details of medical support. And on the Germans, Madam Deputy Speaker, look, we shouldn't forget they have actually done a huge amount of donations, and while it's probably the best sport of the media of the day in the UK to always, pursue them, they have actually delivered MT-70s, GMRS, the same as us. They are one of the biggest contributors to the Ukraine fight, and I think we should give them credit where credit's due, and so I'm grateful for that. I just hope that on the Leopards they will unlock, if they won't do it, they'll unlock other nations to do so.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for what he's doing and support he's giving to Ukraine. Basically, we've got to do what it takes to ensure that Ukraine win this war, and that Putin absolutely understands there'll be no weakening on the Western side in support for Ukraine. But it is a war of attrition at the moment as well. And it's very, very important that it's clear the support that we will be giving to the Ukrainians is ongoing and done in a strategic way. And while I welcome the challenges, they needed these many months ago, and we seem to be piecemeal giving bits of help to the, I'm not in any way undermining the amount that's been given so far. And it means a much more strategic approach in terms of ramping up our production, but in the West as a whole in terms of support there, but also to replenish our own supplies, as my right honourable friend, the Shadow Secretary of State, said. And can I say this final thing to us, he didn't mention, is Belarus. Are we giving a very clear message to Belarus, because of the reports coming through today about them training, joint training exercises with the Russians, that any infringement upon Ukrainian soil from Belarus will meet with serious consequences?
Yes, on Belarus, it's been interesting that Putin's loyalist ally seems to still not yet have committed his forces himself in it, and I think that slightly speaks volumes about, I think the neighbours are sensing quite how weak Putin in one sense has become. When the bully isn't able to bully in the playground, I think you start to see consequences Kazakhstan and elsewhere. Look, we have seen Russians move units up to Belarus and then back out again. We saw them recently doing training, which is I think what he's referring to in that unit. But absolutely, we engage with Belarus, and I think Belarus understands the consequences of what further action would mean to its status in relation to Russia and indeed Ukraine. And I think Ukraine does speak to Belarus as well, as does President Putin, but no good would come off extradition of Belarus. Madam Speaker, just on the piecemeal claim, I understand that, but I also come and balance the calibration that we're trying to achieve with what we do now, and it is important that we do it as a coalition together. The amazing thing about the Ukrainian support is actually it is huge amounts of bilateral arrangements. It isn't, as Russia would like to accuse us of, a NATO-orchestrated event. It isn't a proxy war. It isn't an attack on Russia or Russophobia. It is fundamentally like-minded countries recognising the wrong that's gone on in that country through the invasion, coming together, and they would like us to believe all those other narratives. It's not. It's defending a country, defend itself. And what's great is how many countries around the world agree with upholding human rights and international law and want to come together to help.
Francois.
Deputy Speaker, I warmly welcome the Secretary of State's statement this afternoon, not least as the Ukrainians are now clearly fighting for our freedom as well as for their own. But after what one might call a bruising encounter battle last week between his departmental witnesses and the Defence Committee over the achingly slow re-equipment of our own British Army, I welcome his sense of urgency on that too, but could he specifically declare some of our AFV programmes such as Boxer, the Challenger 3 upgrade and indeed the mobile fires platform as urgent operational requirements, which would mean that we effectively cut all the usual procurement bureaucracy and bring those vital systems into service as soon as possible?
Well, my right honourable friend is as keen as I am on changing the history when it comes to procurement, and it is remarkable that when it comes to assisting Ukraine, how speedy we can get things into the field, or indeed how we can adapt things, or how manufacturers seem to magically adapt things, and there are lessons in there. I'd already started the process earlier of accelerating the Challenger 3 programme last year. I didn't want to take the gap in the middle of the decade, but of course when you accelerate you take risk, but nevertheless I think that is important. I will definitely look at his suggestion. Of course, the one elephant in the room on the suggestion of accelerating is Her Majesty's Treasury, who would have to reprofile the budget, and of course as the time of the IR approaches I shall engage with my right honourable friend the Chancellor.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Night after night, the Russians continue to fire missiles at the Ukrainian civilian population. And we saw at the weekend the attack on the residential block in Dnipro that has so far claimed at least 20 lives. Just before Christmas, the United States announced that it would provide the Patriot missile system to Ukraine. What assessment has the Defence Secretary made of the impact that will have on Ukraine's ability to defend itself against these missiles, and what further capability could Ukraine use in order to try and further mitigate the effect of these frequent attacks which are trying to destabilise the country and cut off the energy supply?
The right honourable gentleman made an observation about the powerful and enduring impact of these horrendous attacks. There is echoes of the V1 and the V2 campaign with little intelligence targeting by the looks of things, and an attempt to terrify people across the Ukraine. Firstly, the way that I think it has improved the defence of the airspace, and despite Russia's claim, the vast proportion still of those munitions don't make it through. The tragedy is some do, and we of course would all like to work to make it 100% certain. The Patriot missile is obviously a long-range interballistic missile, effectively interceptor, and is probably more use at some stages against some of the more sophisticated UAVs or missiles that could be fired or are fired occasionally, and of course we'd all be worried about the next Iranian ballistic missiles if they were put in. The other thing volume is what the Ukrainians need. They need volume of the short range, the medium range, they need volume of ammunition to deal with some of this whole range of UAV. That's the real key, is that you can have the most sophisticated launchers in the world, but if you can't afford the missiles, you soon run out, as Russia is now finding itself. Volume and better coordination and better targeting. The United Kingdom has helped, and I said in the House last time that we used our knowledge to advise them and help them on how to layer their air defence better and to prioritise the infrastructure they need to defend, because there are so many targets that the Russians are firing at. They need to start with the priority list, and they're doing that now. It is having an effect. But that's why we're now seeing Russia being more indiscriminate, just throwing it at anything that's less predictable and therefore harder to defend.
Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for his statement today and the welcome news of the latest UK package of support, including the Challenger 2 tanks and Bulldog, and also the support from other international partners such as the US and France. But can he reassure us that he plus colleagues in the FCDO and the diplomatic routes that we have will continue to do all they can to make sure that we bring on board maximum support from other countries and through the bilateral relationships that we have, because that is going to be so crucial to maximise the force multiplier effect that he referred to in his statement earlier, both I think in terms of military and humanitarian.
Yes, my honourable friend's right. You know, I come to this House obviously to talk about defence and weaponry and lethal aid. But there are other pillars in this. There is the diplomatic pillar, it's incredibly important, the economic pillar through sanctions, and that is a very, very important track to engage on. And I know some of that work isn't made public, but some of it is. And Russia is currently seeing its economy damaged by these sanctions, and they won't be moved anytime soon. And it is important to recognise that there is a diplomatic track. There's a diplomatic track open to President Putin, should he wish to end this senseless violence and invasion and seek to remove his forces from Ukraine. Of course there's a track open. This is not a one-way thing, and we will work very hard on it. But absolutely, the military is hand-in-hand with diplomacy and the economy, and we need to make sure we keep that up, whether that's at the UN, whether it's bilaterally, or whether it's with a new fora as well.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and the Liberal Democrats would like to very much welcome the Secretary of State's statement today. And building on his exposition of the economic, diplomatic and military levers, could I just also add that communication levers are really key. We know that Russian propaganda wishes to twist international support for Ukraine into a narrative that suggests that somehow this is a war of self-defence, with Russia fighting against NATO in self-defence. How is the Secretary of State working with Cabinet colleagues and with people who work on strategic communications in the MOD to counter that narrative?
I think it's incredibly important we counter it. He's right, and you know, you'll have heard me say twice from the dispatch box what this is not. It isn't an attack on Russia. It's not a proxy war. It's not a NATO-orchestrated aggression in any way at all. It is fundamentally about helping Ukraine defend itself. We make sure we message that throughout government, but also we make sure that we message that as much as possible into Russia. So Russians understand the consequences of President Putin's badly thought through special operation. And it's also why I think what we're seeing is fractures in the Russian General Command and indeed the political leaders who themselves know that nothing is going to plan. But it is important, and it's important far further across the globe. When there are grain shortages in Africa or people can't afford it, it's not because of the West. It's because of what Russia has done in the Black Sea and Russia is doing to the ports of Mariupol and places like that. That's why Africans are finding it hard to get grain and paying more for it, because of Russia.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend describes the Russian armed forces as poorly led and badly equipped. What assessment does he make of the Wagner Group that seems to be operating independently and with allegedly more successful effect? And am I right in thinking that an organisation that pulls criminals out of jail and sends them into battle is surely operating well outside the law of armed conflict?
My honourable friend makes a really important point about Wagner. I think for a long time Wagner has operated outside the rules of any law. I think that has been its selling point in Africa, in Libya, in Mali, that pay for us with contracts or diamonds or whatever, and that there are no rules, and they have been observed on numerous occasions engaged in war crimes and events, but their proximity to the Kremlin, of course, doesn't fool anyone that this is somehow some unilateral, purely commercial operation. Currently, we think they're using 2/3 of their force around Bakhmut area are 2/3 convicts taken from prisons. They're suffering approximately 2/3 casualty rates. So it's not a good deal if you're a convict in the Wagner Group. But it's also a very worrying reflection. If I was General Gerasimov, I'd be asking myself why I am outwitted, outperformed by a bunch of mercenaries and rivals, by the looks of things, in Moscow. And what does it say about the Russian army that it takes a bunch of mercenaries, as they would see it, to get some traction? However, I wouldn't believe Wagner's propaganda either. There isn't much traction. There is only death, either at the hands of their paid commanders or indeed at the hands of their own men to their own selves. You've seen the social media videos where they executed a convict of their own using a sledgehammer.
Sir Chris Bryant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Chair. Deputy Speaker, sorry. This war hasn't been going on for 10 months. It's been going on for 9 years, and we do need to make sure that Putin ultimately loses. But it's not just about military solutions. It's also about economic ones, rebuilding, reconstructing, and frankly protecting many Ukrainians from the freezing cold this winter, and being able to put food on the table for their children over the years to come. At the moment, we've guaranteed something like £3 billion worth of financial support, but there's an easier solution. There's more than £23 billion worth of Russian assets sitting in British banks. Why don't we seize them and send them to Ukraine?
Well, the right honourable gentleman, first of all, makes the most important point. Even before the 24th of February, Russia had killed 18,000 Ukrainian troops since 2014. There wasn't a month or a week that went by on that border where they weren't shot. So when we say to people, oh, it might escalate or it might be a war, Ukrainians often look at us in sort of, where have you been for the last decade? And it's very sobering if you go to Kyiv, to the memorial, and most of those plaques are way before February 2021. On the building and refurbishment and the support to the refugees, this is where I think Germany needs to get the credit. Germany and Poland have hosted tens of thousands of Ukrainians. It is putting lots of money into aid support for Ukraine and is making a significant difference. And I think that is, I've often said, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the strength of an alliance of 30, 40 people is we can move at different speeds, and nevertheless with that. And on his point of Russian assets, as the former criminal finance minister and security minister, I would be quite interested to know why we can't.
Vicky Ford. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I join others in thanking my right honourable friend for his statement today and our ongoing support to Ukraine? I want to follow up on what my honourable friend just said about the Wagner Group. We heard last week how the brutal attack on the tiny town of Solidar has literally left the fields littered with the corpses of men. And my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, has just agreed from the dispatch box that this is an organisation that has been guilty of many war crimes in many parts of the world, not least last year in Mali, also had a CAR to his list. It's been put to me that if the Wagner Group was prescribed as a terrorist organisation, this could make it much more difficult for Prigozhin to recruit into this organisation. So can I urge my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, to work with the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary to make sure that we're gathering all the evidence we have against the Wagner Group and taking every single action we could to try to curtail their activities, including prescribing them as a terrorist organisation if it comes to that.
Secretary of State.
Look, I'm very happy to take that away and look at exactly that. Although I'm not sure they recruit at all anymore. I think they just pile people in.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Defence Secretary for giving a full exposition of the military aid which he is providing. It's so important that Ukrainians have the most advanced systems at their disposal. However, we also know that Putin is targeting the energy infrastructure across Ukraine. I wonder if he could set out a little bit more about what we're doing to help protect that and also rebuild it for the future.
State.
Yes, first of all, generators. We are providing generators and the international community is. I'm very happy to write to the Honourable Lady with the exact numbers of generators, in other words, to mitigate the effect of these strikes. At the same time, as I said to her the Honourable Lady's friend sitting behind her, that we have helped with the coordination and the priorities of that. And at the same time, a number of international partners are helping with the training and support of those brave men and women who are going out there to fix those infrastructures. Almost immediately they are hit and taken down, and making more and more people able to look after the electricity infrastructure. But it is incredibly important. But of course, Putin will know that weather improves, hopefully, in the spring, and then some of his impacts will be lessened. So I think that's one of the other reasons we're seeing an increase currently of strikes.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
How many defence reviews can my right honourable friend recall that have been preceded by fashionable commentators decrying the idea that main battle tanks had any utility in modern warfare? And now that that has been disproved, and my right honourable friend has made a hugely significant move this week by agreeing to send main battle tanks in the support of Ukraine's defence, will he consider sending more tanks if these tanks prove to be effective and can be effectively supported? And can we use this as an opportunity to bolster and strengthen the supply chain and manufacture of our next generation of tanks, now that he has proved to the Treasury that they are not a waste of money?
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Well, first of all, the good thing about the Challenger 3 supply chain, it's in Stockport and Telford, is where we are doing the work on the Challenger 3s, and I'm delighted it's near where we're also doing the Boxers. So we are reinvigorating the land systems supply chain. But on his points about tanks, no one was ever writing that we should get rid of tanks, and indeed, hopefully my defence review was a bit better than the defence review that said there was no use for a machine gun after the Japanese-Russian war, or indeed the brave admiral who said that submarines had absolutely no utility in the lead up to most of them being sunk, and I think the Firth of Forth by a German U-boat. So I don't think we said that, but I do think, yes, it has showed that armour is important, especially if not just from the basic protection of hand grenades dropped by UAVs, but it also shows that without your armour properly protected in a 360 way, you are also incredibly vulnerable to handheld anti-tank weapons that, if you notice, the British NLAW and the US Javelin are successfully remodelling hundreds and hundreds of T-72s from very short distance. So we have to have proper protection, both electronically but also in the layered defence that we need in this modern battlefield.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whatever the manifold differences that we have in this place, it's good that people across Ukraine and Russia will have heard once again the resolute message from this place on all sides of the House. We support the Secretary of State's move to donate those Challenger tanks, and that we're absolutely resolute that Putin's aggression must fail. Now, the Secretary of State said in his statement that the Challenger tank donation will help not only to resist the Russians, but also to expel them. We've heard Ukrainian officials and NATO Secretary General saying that Russia is planning a major offensive this spring. So can the Secretary of State tell us what more the UK can do to set up a broad support beyond tanks to support the Ukrainians to repel that major Russian aggression?
I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman's comments. And look, I recognise that 14 tanks is not going to change the course of history. But it is also about trying to be that force multiplier, putting the 14 tanks to the 50 Bradleys and the divisional level of deep long-range artillery, and hopefully unlocking Leopard tanks across Europe. If we can do that, then I think we can raise a significant mass that is important to enable that fire and that manoeuvre warfare that will be needed to push Russia out. Of course, Russia has planned for an offensive, and the Gerasimov being reappointed effectively, he'll be able to make the same mistakes twice that he did the first time. But nevertheless, yes, they're not giving up, but nor are we. I noticed social media in Russia commenting that our decision to send Challenger tanks would change nothing. Yeah, he's right, it won't change nothing. Ukraine will continue to win and Russia will continue to lose.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I please thank the Defence Secretary for his statement, which I welcome, and also to commend him and his department for the superb work that's been undertaken right now to help defend Ukraine. As he knows, armour is logistically very challenging. So could I please ask him to confirm how it's going to be deployed, whether risks to the supply chain can be mitigated at all, and also whether we have a plan for how we're going to turn our own land equipment availability back from red to green.
Right, on the last point, and I'm grateful to my friend for the question, on the last point, the first point, of course, to be honest about the state of our armoured fleet, our land systems. I've been pretty brutal in the House here about how actually the state of it is not acceptable, and it hasn't been in a good state for over a decade, if not much longer. And how they've got away with that, how it's happened, I do not know. So if we're not honest, we can't start that process. We're putting the £24 billion to modernise or change that fleet as much as possible. And he's right on the supply chain. Not only are we well supported by some of the neighbouring states in thinking that through, the Slovakians have been very forward-leaning about helping support the T-72s or refurbishing, but also in making sure that we are doing an assessment of our supply chain to see what is needed. It is timely because obviously with our Challenger 3 upgrade, we are needing a supply chain to be reinvigorated, and that's what we'll work on. But I'm very happy to meet with him to discuss it further.
Jim Shannon.
Deputy Speaker, can I congratulate the Secretary of State and our UK Government on following through on commitments to support Ukraine, the provision of the 14 Challenger 2 tanks and other donations as evidenced today in this statement. With the potential of a Russian offensive, clearly more tanks are needed. More anti-missile defences are also critical to enable Ukrainians to get on their feet and to survive and to end this conflict with Russia once and for all. Will the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland has shown the will and the physical commitment? Can I make a special appeal, please, for the anti-missile defences so that Ukrainians can keep the lights on, heat their homes, save lives, and along with the generators and the engineering help is there, that Ukraine can rebuild itself?
Yes, we're committed to that, and today I announced some more high-velocity missile and indeed low-velocity, the other missiles, both made in Northern Ireland, that are doing a fantastic job.
Richard Graham.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the Defence Secretary has laid out very clearly the reasons why the Government is providing a squadron of 14 Challenger tanks to help the defence of Ukraine. And he's also implied that issues of supply chain, spares, ammo and training have all been carefully considered. But my right honourable friend will also accept, I think, that the biggest contribution the Challengers may play is the diplomatic one of helping him unlock solid commitments by the 14 Leopard-using nations. Could my right honourable friend confirm what he thinks the impact of any commitments at that meeting in Germany might be, combined with the Challenger tanks, on the Russian armed forces leaders?
Well, I would hope that the Russian armed forces recognise over the Christmas break that their best bet is to cut and run, or to indeed stop and withdraw. And I think that is dawning on a significant number of commanders. The problem is the commanders aren't around long enough to be able to pull the levers to make a difference. With Surovikin being replaced by Gerasimov, maybe Gerasimov has been put in prime position to be the fall guy in 3 months' time, like all his predecessors on that, and maybe that is the cunning Kremlin plan. I don't know. But it is important that we recognise that somehow Russia needs to come to its senses about what is happening. The special operation has failed and is failing, and the best thing they can do is leave, and then we will try and find a way forward.
McCartney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sadly, we've seen more evidence this weekend of Putin's barbaric targeting of civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, particularly with the residential blocks in Dnipro. And that's why I welcome today's announcement on the Challenger 2 tanks. Can the Secretary of State just confirm that we're not going this alone? And on behalf of my Ukrainian community in Huddersfield and Colne Valley, who are so proud of our steadfast support for Ukraine, can the Secretary of State also confirm we're continuing with our donations, as he said, of generators, humanitarian support and medical supplies for the Ukrainian people?
Yes, those supplies are going to get even more important, and I'll do everything I can to stimulate more of that. And if honourable and right honourable members of the House have companies in their constituency who are keen or indeed are facing barriers to being able to do that, then please make sure that I am made aware and we will see what we can do. Look, we just have to do everything in the next few months to stop this targeting of the cities and in infrastructure, help them see that through, help them defeat it. But, you know, targeting civilian blocks in Dnieper does nothing but commit murder.
Dr. Matthew Offord.
The removal of Russian forces from cities such as Kherson has led some civilians to return to their homes, even though the areas are contaminated with explosive weapons. Last week, as chairman of the all-party parliamentary group on explosive weapons, I met a Ukrainian MP who was seeking to put together a civil demining programme. Can the Secretary of State ensure that his officials will be available to meet with myself and other interested parties so that we may be able to put together a programme to help people as they return to conflict in an appropriate and timely manner?
Look, I'm delighted to meet with him, or indeed my officials, with it. You'll notice within the statement I announced £28 million towards minefield bridging capabilities, combat engineering, which is desperately needed.
I thank the Secretary of State for answering me for the statement on point of order. Jim McMahon.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On a point of order, last week the High Court ruled against the Dartmoor National Park Authority, who sought to protect the right of free access for wild camping. This is a significant backward step, seemingly putting the financial interests of one person above the fundamental access rights which have been hard fought for and provided for in law by this House. Madam Speaker, this goes beyond Dartmoor and could potentially put at risk rights and protections for national parks, including the right to roam. Can I ask, have you had any notice from the Secretary of State of her intention to make a statement to the House? And if not, can you advise the House on how best to pursue this issue on behalf of communities across the country who could be affected by this judgment? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order and for giving me notice of it. I can confirm that I have not had notice of a statement on this matter. However, the honourable gentleman has put his point on the record, and ministers and the Treasury bench will have heard his point of order. With regard to advice as to how to bring this matter to the attention of the House in the future, he's a very experienced member of the House. I'm sure he will know of the various options that are available to him, but if he wants any further advice, I would suggest that he speaks to the clerks in the table office. Thank you. Point of order, Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are rumours abound this evening across the House that the Government may table a statement this evening. I wonder if your office or the Office of the Speaker have been advised by the Government that that is their intention.
Thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. I have received no notification, and I'm not aware that the Speaker has of any statement that is likely to be made tonight. Point of order, Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Staveley Town Council in my constituency, which is led by self-styled Staveley Independents with the support of the Liberal Democrats, has effectively gone bankrupt. And I'm told since November that staff have either not been paid at all or have been paid late. If it was a Tier 1 or Tier 2 authority, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities would intervene. But as it is a parish or town council, I'm told there is no such mechanism in place. Have you or Mr Speaker been notified of the intention for the Department for Levelling Up to make any statement on this matter, which is of great concern to my constituents? And if not, can you give me any advice as to how we may be able to ensure that members of staff at Staveley Town Council are paid and that services continue to be provided whilst the authority attempts to extricate itself from the current crisis it's in?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that point of order. It's obviously a very worrying situation for the staff of the council. I'm not aware of any statement that's intended to be made about it. The Treasury bench and ministers will clearly have heard the honourable gentleman's concerns. I mean, I would suggest that perhaps he either tables some questions or writes to the appropriate minister or seeks a meeting with the appropriate minister in order to find out whether there are any ways in which this situation can be resolved. Point of order, David Linden.
Madam Deputy Speaker, unfortunately I was unable to catch the eye of the Honourable Gentleman from Bosworth, who I think was handing out some crib sheets earlier on in advance of the next debate. I know we are going to be discussing minimum service standard levels, but given that crib sheets are being handed out, could the service be extended to those of us on this side of the House as well?
Yes, well, I thank the honourable gentleman for that point of order. I'm afraid I have really no responsibility for pieces of paper that may be handed out, unless, of course, they have gone through the table office. Thank you. We now come to presentation of Bill Paul Maynard.
Relocation of the House of Lords. Report to Parliament Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 3rd of March.
Friday the 3rd of March. Thank you. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Strikes. Minimum Service Levels Bill. Second reading.
Now.
I must inform the House that the reasoned amendments have not been selected, so I call Secretary of State Grant Shapps to move the second reading.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the bill be now read a second time. This government firmly believes the ability to strike is an important element of industrial relations in the UK. It's rightly protected by law, and we understand that an element of disruption is likely with any strike. But we also need to maintain a reasonable balance between the ability of workers to strike with the rights of the public, who work hard and expect the essential services they pay for to be there when they need them. And we need to be able to have confidence that when strikes occur, people's lives and livelihoods are not put at undue risk. It has been clear from the recent industrial... I'll just make a little bit of progress first, if you don't mind. It's become clear from recent industrial action that this isn't always the case, Madam Deputy Speaker, so we need to have a safety net in place to ensure the public don't become collateral damage. Right now, up and down the country, households are struggling with the repercussions of high inflation caused by COVID and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And the UK isn't alone in feeling the pressure, which is also felt by many other countries, and particularly within the European Union. Recently, the Prime Minister outlined the government's priorities to build a better, more secure and more prosperous future, one this country and our workforce, public or private, fully deserve. By halving inflation, growing the economy and getting debt down, we can ensure our vital public services are fit. As the government gets on with these priorities, we also have a duty to protect access to vital public services, which, let's not forget, the public are paying for through their taxation. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Secretary of State, I believe in the fundamental right of a worker to withdraw their labour, if it happens to be either an employer or against government. I understand, Secretary of State, that at this time there are many people who feel the same, and for those people who are toying with the idea, I mean, the ambulance service, for example, the nurses, the doctors have all been able to ensure that there's been emergency service. Does government really believe that withdrawing the right of a worker to withdraw their labour is what they're about? I don't think it is.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I always think that people think very carefully about this, and I think they're right to do so. We are operating within the context of a crisis in global growth. The IMF says a third of the world will be in recession this year, caused by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And although I'm surprised to hear members opposite sort of yawning and moaning. Putin invaded Ukraine. What happened what members opposite don't seem to realise, Madam Deputy Speaker, is what then happened to energy prices caused a crisis which has put up inflation throughout the Western world. And that has, of course, led to... I'll just make this point because I think the members opposite may find it useful. Those prices going up throughout the rest of the world, and here included, have also pushed up wage claims. But I don't think that we should get into a 1970s spiral, where we end up with higher wage claims, higher wage settlements, higher wage claims and inflation continuing forever. That is a cycle that we must break. And clearly, if we're to meet all the inflation-busting demands of the unions, that wouldn't just make life harder for some, it would make life hard for every single family in this country, and that is why we cannot do that. So the government is therefore absolutely clear about this. We want constructive dialogue with the unions, and the public has had enough of the constant and most unwelcome, frankly dangerous disruptions to their lives. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Last week, Human Rights Watch warned that, and I quote, fundamental and hard-won rights are being systematically dismantled in the UK. Isn't this anti-strike legislation part of this danger that Human Rights Watch are warning about, Secretary of State?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the International Labour Organisation actually says themselves, and I'll cover it shortly in the speech, they actually say themselves that it's perfectly proper to have a balance between minimum service levels and people's rights to strike. And you know what? I support the ILO in saying that. I absolutely agree that they're right. But I notice the honourable gentleman didn't mention the fact that he's received £94,000 plus from unions. You know, I have no issue with them receiving that money from unions. I don't think we should have taxpayer-funded political parties in this House. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think it's only right that when members opposite stand up, they reflect what is on their record, which is they've received a lot of money from unions, which they now seek to represent in the debate here today. From millions of people who rely on essential transport to get to work, or to family commitments, who every day now have the extra stress of worrying about making alternative arrangements, sometimes costly arrangements, because of these forever strikes. To those who at the most terrifying time of their lives, perhaps with a loved one, a poorly loved one, not knowing if an ambulance is going to arrive because the unions have refused to provide a national safety net. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hear the barracking. I understand that they understand that they don't want to hear what people are feeling throughout this country. But it is a fact that when the strikes are on and when ambulances are unable to find out from their unions whether they will operate or not, that is an additional concern for members of the public, including their own constituents, who they seem rather not to care about in this case, which I'm surprised. I'm just going to make a little bit of progress. There are then, of course, children who are desperately trying to catch up on the lost learning. I will give way shortly, but I'll just make a little bit of progress. Those children who are desperately trying to catch up on learning which they missed throughout COVID, again, unsure if they're going to be able to get to school. And the businesses whose sales and productivity are suffering throughout the land, who are terrified at a time of this high inflation, their livelihoods are at risk, and those of those that they employ. So I will give way.
Grateful to the Secretary of State. Could he give us a little bit more indication of how he will consult and agree minimum standards in the railway industry?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the way that the legislation will work, I'll set out in a bit more detail in a while, but briefly speaking, it will be in each of the individual sectors that secondary legislation will be used by regulation in order to come to the right balance. And I will explain that in a little bit more detail if he's patient. I will in just a moment. I have already taken more interventions from that side of the House. There are I think it's true to say, there comes a time when we can't let this continue, and that is why we need minimum safety and service levels, Madam Deputy Speakers, to keep livelihoods and lives safe. And it's frankly irresponsible, even surprising, for the opposition opposite to suggest otherwise. But I will give away on that point.
State for giving way. He wants to talk about minimum safety.
The reality is this: after 12 years of a Tory government, minimum safety no longer exists in our NHS. A paramedic contacted me directly at the weekend to say that he'd begun his shift at 7 o'clock in the morning, expecting to sign off later that evening. For the entirety of that shift, he spent it sitting outside of Hull Royal Infirmary because the patient he had, whose life he'd saved, didn't have a bed available. There isn't any safety in the NHS as a result of this Tory government. He needs to acknowledge that before we move on to discuss anything else.
I'm surprised at the way that the honourable gentleman, who normally speaks a lot of sense in this House, the way he puts his point across. Yes, of course, it's the case that the NHS has been under unbelievable stress, not least because of 2 years of having COVID and all of the backlog that has been created. It's worth reminding them, Madam Deputy Speaker, had they had their way, we would have been in lockdown a heck of a lot longer, and those cases would have been even worse. But I do not follow the logic of the honourable gentleman's argument, because he seems to be arguing that just because there are times of danger, we ought to, by design, enable a system which prevents unions in the ambulance service actually telling the NHS when they will be there and what the minimum service would be. And that is the issue that we seek to address today. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
For giving way. If this is all about safety, can you tell us why the word safety is not used once in the bill or explanatory notes?
Well, it's fairly obvious to say that if a minimum service level in, for example, something like railways is about people's livelihoods rather than safety, but when it comes to the NHS, when it comes to that ambulance service not being agreed nationally, then that is an issue of a minimum safety level. So I would have thought it's pretty straightforward. And I'll just make a little bit of progress. The strikes minimum service level bill will ensure that we protect the ability of workers to take industrial action, but that will also protect the public from disproportionate disruption to their daily lives. And to put it simply, that one person's right to strike doesn't infringe on someone else's right to life and limb. Turning to the detail, there's an array of riches. I'll give way to the right honourable lady.
Register of interest. The Secretary of State has never negotiated a minimum service agreement in the NHS. I have. And as a result of that, the Secretary of State is completely fabricating what happens. It is the trade unions which work with the staff and the employers to put a safe agreement.
I'm afraid I will have to ask the honourable lady to withdraw the remark about fabricating. She will do that, I know. I'm sure that's not what she meant to say. It indicates that that is what she didn't mean to say. Yes?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, for your guidance. I will rephrase what I was saying. That the reality is that safe agreements are negotiated between the staff and the employers. The reality happens on the ground, so the process and the outcomes protects the NHS because that's what staff want to do. So will he ensure that he reflects the truth of what happens in the NHS?
Well, look, I just would say to the honourable lady, who I know has received money from GMB, RMT, Unite the Union, CLP, amongst others. Nothing wrong with that. I'm just putting it on the record to simply say she is wrong factually about the way that the last two strikes have occurred, both last week and in December, because I'm actually answering your colleague's point one at a time. Because the way that ambulance strike worked was that the NHS were unable to find out in advance from the ambulance unions where and when nationwide cover would be provided. This is the NHS who've said this, not government. This is the NHS. And as a result of that, it's meant that they haven't been able to put the appropriate level of cover in place in advance. And if, Madam Deputy Speaker, if by chance we are wrong about that, there's a safety mechanism in this bill for that, because although we're taking these primary powers, should Parliament decide to do so, we have said that we do not want to use these powers if voluntary arrangements can be made. And I refer members opposite to the voluntary arrangements. Let me just finish the first point and move on with the speech a bit. I refer members opposite to the voluntary arrangements that were successfully made with the Royal College of Nursing. Now, in their cases, they did provide that national guarantee. It wouldn't be necessary to put these measures in place. I'm going to just, and I hope the House will appreciate, there are a lot of people who want to contribute. I want to give people the opportunity to do that in their own speeches. So I'm going to turn for a moment, if members don't mind, to the detail of the bill itself. The bill establishes a legal framework to implement minimum safety and service levels during periods of strike action. It will achieve this by amending the existing legislation, that's the Trade Union and Labour Relations Thank you, folks. Consolidation Act 1992. I was trying to get conciliatory in there for the members opposite. The legislation will allow regulations to be made to ensure that specified services cannot shut down and completely when workers strike. And this is in order to maintain crucial and in many cases life-saving services. The relevant sectors specified in the legislation are health services, fire and rescue services, education services, transport services, decommissioning of nuclear installation and management of radioactive waste and spent fuel, and border security. I will give point on that point.
And the Secretary of State helped me with this. In the Human Rights Memorandum, which accompanied the Transport Strikes Minimum Services Level Bill last October, it was specifically stated that government legal advice was that it wasn't justifiable, it wasn't necessary in a democratic society to have these sort of restrictions in the field of emergency and patient care services, fire and rescues and education, but only in transport. Now, that doesn't appear in the Human Rights Memorandum which accompanies this bill. Can the government tell me, has their legal advice changed, or have they just changed their mind for reasons of political convenience?
Well, the Honourable Lady must surely have noticed that subsequently we've had disruption in the NHS, including in the ambulance service. And what's happened in that disruption is, although the nurses have very sensibly provided a national level of safe service, the same has not happened, unfortunately, in the ambulance service. And that is why this legislation is required in other areas at this time. Using the... I've given away once today, I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He's under a constant onslaught of noise from the other side, which shows terrific support for those in the unions in their constituencies and those in the unions who are funding their own constituency offices, but seems to forget the interests of all our constituents, which are indeed in these minimum service level agreements that he is proposing, because ultimately, whether it is someone we know or we don't know in our constituency, they need to know that in the 6 sectors that he is proposing, there will be a minimum service provided, regardless of the right of the people in that sector to hold back their labour on a pay negotiation or for any other reason. That is a reasonable proposition, Madam Deputy Speaker, and we should be heard.
Order. Before the Secretary of State answers, I do think it's quite important that in this debate we do use moderation in language and don't impugn motives on others that may be not quite how we want the debate to continue. It's an important subject, so let us try to introduce that into the discussion we're having. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right about the issue of the reason for minimal standards being required, and I will give way in just a moment if I can make it a little bit of progress. Using the powers proposed within the bill, regulations will be set about the specific services within each of those sectors where a minimum level of service will be applied, and the levels themselves as well. Regulations will be tailored to each relevant service, taking account of the different risks to public safety or impacts on the daily life and of the economy. The legislation is clear, however. The regulations may only be made after appropriate consultation and the approval of both houses in this place. Of course, the government may choose not to use the regulation-making powers in the bill if adequate voluntary agreements, where necessary, are already in place between employers and the relevant sectors and the relevant unions. I just wanted to finish the sentence, and I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
Presence in the chamber after so many attempts at intervening, but also will he now pass comment on the fact that life and limb cover already exists in legislation and that the true purpose of this shameful bill is simply to erode workers' rights?
Yep. Well, look, I just simply don't accept that point. Although it's true that life and limb measures exist, what we have seen through many, many months now of rail closures, through the strikes that have taken place both last week and back in December, what we have seen is that, unfortunately, minimum service levels in one case and actually minimum safety levels in another have simply not been available. And that, I'm afraid, I know that members opposite don't want to accept this fundamental point, but their constituents' lives are being put at risk by the NHS not having the ability to put in place the correct cover with sufficient notice. They seem to imagine, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the army will just be there at no notice and with no ability to organise which areas of the country they'll need to be in. And that, I'm afraid, is not a practical way to run the...
Order. I can't hear the answer that the Secretary of State is giving to the question. There's no point in just shouting when he's actually answering the question. Secretary of State.
Speaker, I suppose the fundamental point is we very much hope in many cases we don't need to use these powers that the legislation confers. But indeed, we have seen that this is not always possible. I'll give way to the Honourable.
To the Minister. I'm a member of the GMB. I don't happen to have had any money from the GMB, though I will be proud to take money from the GMB. Certainly a lot prouder than receiving £2.5 million from Lyubov Chernukin. But can the Secretary of State confirm that this legislation cannot possibly be used to sort out the present winter of discontent? If anything, it's going to make it far more difficult to secure a resolution of any of the individual strikes. And therefore, it's just political posturing.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think the GMB heard his a pitch for some money. If he gets it, it will join the £120 million that the unions have provided to the party opposite since 2010. And I only make this point because it's relevant to the debate today, which is to say that we must be here to represent our constituents. And our constituents know, by looking at the recent strikes, that where the Royal College of Nursing worked with the NHS, they were able to provide timely assurances at a national level to ensure the most critical services, including chemotherapy, critical care, paediatrics and A&E, were not affected. But showing that even when parties disagree, they can do so in a mature manner. But unfortunately, this isn't always the case. And I'll just finish this point and then I will give way. During recent strike action taken by the ambulance service, and this has been referred to a couple of times, and I want to read this because it's factually written down, the NHS has not been reassured by the relevant union that they could rely on the current system of voluntary local derogation, which I think is what the Honourable Lady was talking about earlier. And they couldn't rely on those arrangements to ensure patient and public services. So what happened was last week and in December, arrangements were being disputed right up to the wire, right up to the last minute. And that created uncertainty and left officials with little time to organise contingency measures such as military support. And that is the situation we cannot, in all conscience, allow to continue. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and I will declare that I'm a proud member of a trade union and a trade union officer for a number of years before coming into Parliament. In fact, I have probably been part of the negotiations for around 1,000 or so pay and conditions negotiations that were all actually resolved where the employer and the employees were all perfectly happy with the outcome, something that the Secretary of State has been unable to do, whether it's in the railway or whether it's much more widely, which is why we're having this debate. Can he accept that he's failed and it's time to get the trade unionists in the room and to put this legislation in the bin where it belongs?
But in fairness to the Honourable Lady, it is the case that the employers and the unions, and more recently the ministers as well, have been meeting. So it's not the case that they haven't been meeting. It's also the case that even where they have met ministerially, including in Scotland and in Labour Wales, that disputes have also continued. So we clearly need to continue. We can't continue to rely on voluntary arrangements to ensure the safety of people we represent. After all, strokes and heart attacks don't respect the boundaries of, for example, trust borders. And I'm intrigued to know what the members opposite would actually say to their constituents, perhaps to grieving constituents, who've lost loved ones because of some sort of postcode lottery. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
At my weekly surgery last week, a constituent asked me, why is it that the party opposite are too scared to ask their trade union colleagues to come to the table and negotiate a peaceful resolution? I couldn't...
Order. It really is just shouting down somebody else. No. Saki Barty, finish the point.
I couldn't figure out why they're scared to encourage them to come around the table. Why does the Secretary of State think they're so scared to get a peaceful resolution to these strikes?
Well, I think there are 120 million very good answers to that question by my honourable friend. But I think, look, we have the opportunity to keep people, their families and their jobs safe during periods of disruption, and that is what we intend to do. I will in just a moment, if I can make a little progress. The bill and subsequent regulations are therefore designed to enable employers to specify the workers required in order to meet minimum safety and service levels during strikes within relevant sectors. As I say, I will in just a moment. I'd just like to make a little bit of progress. This will be done through work notices, and should a union notify an employer of a strike in accordance with the existing normal rules, the bill will allow the employer to issue a work notice to the union specifying the workers needed to work during a strike to secure the minimum level of safety and service. Employers will be required to consult the union on the number of workers to be identified in the work notice and the work to be undertaken, and have regard to the union's views before issuing that work notice. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank the Minister for giving way. It seems like the members opposite do not think that anybody striking lives in their constituency, which I find quite strange. But my question to the Minister is this. Will the Minister confirm that once his words have been scrutinised in this chamber, if any of his words are found to be misleading or incorrect, that he will return to the chamber and correct the record as soon as possible, preferably by the end of the week?
Well, I'm sure all the normal parliamentary rules apply, and so I would never stand here and seek to do such a thing. And in the interests of transparency, I'll mention the £11,100 that the honourable member has received from various, actually just from the CLP union in this House. Since we're talking about, also. Sorry, CLP. Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker. CLP from Unite the Union, I should have finished by saying, just to satisfy members opposite. Additionally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the work notice must not... Let me just explain how this operates, and if honourable members opposite will just...
Order. It really is important that we hear what the Secretary of State has to say, but I would also say it is important as well that any reference to donations or payments is accurate. Thank you. Secretary of State.
I should say CLP from the Unite the Union is absolutely right to correct me. Corrected at the dispatch box, Madam Deputy Speaker. Additionally, the work notice must not list more people than reasonably necessary to meet the minimum level of safety and service, and employers must have no regard to whether someone is or is not a member of the union, or presumably even the CLP, when deciding if they need to be included in that works notice. Each employer and the union must also adhere to data protection legislation. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way, and my union membership is a proud one and it's recorded in the members' interest. And I used to be a full-time union organiser. The Minister claims that the public's existence and lives are at risk because of these disputes. Does he not appreciate that thousands of nurses leaving the National Health Service, thousands of other workers in the NHS leaving, thousands of teachers leaving because of stress, because of low pay, because of underfunding? Those are the things that cause a great deal of stress and problems for the public. Instead of reaching for the statute book and trying to legally constrain trade unions from their legitimate action, why doesn't he address the fundamental causes, which are poverty pay, stress, bad conditions and inadequate service in all parts of the UK?
Madam Deputy Speaker, and the right honourable gentleman should note, I think, that there are 40,000 more nurses now, and that it's very, very important, and more doctors as well. I think it's also important to say that I agree with him for once, that we should, of course, try to work, and are trying to work, constructively to bring strikes to a conclusion. But we must not do that at the expense of the lives and the livelihoods of our own constituents. It is not the case that the strikes are, in all cases, perfectly safe for our own constituents, and that's why we must act. And unions must take reasonable steps to ensure that members do not participate in strikes if they've been named on a work notice. It's up to unions to ensure public safety and not put lives at risk. Only if they fail to do so could they face civil action in court. The government unions, I'll just make a little bit more progress because I think Madam Deputy Speaker would like to hear from other members of the House as well, and I have been as generous as possible with allowing interventions. The government unions and employers and workers have a role to play in ensuring essential services continue even during strikes, and that is what we are ensuring. This approach is balanced, it's reasonable, and above all, it is fair. In some countries, such as Australia and Canada, there is an ability to outright ban strikes that endanger lives, for example, in some of their blue light services. However, this legislation does not seek to ban the right to strike. The government will always defend the principle that workers should be able to withdraw their labour. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will in a moment. In fact, Madam Deputy Speaker, the only time that the right to strike was removed from emergency services was from a Liberal Prime Minister, Lord George, as part of the Police Act 1919. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we do not propose to follow the Lib Dems' example. I give way.
I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way. We're living at a time when democracy and freedom are under threat all across the world, and the right to strike is an important right.
Order. Please don't shout down the honourable lady.
Thank you for clarifying it. He's just mentioned that the minimum service levels exist in many other countries, such as, I believe, Italy, Spain, France. I don't know if members opposite have ever been to France, but they have been known to strike in France. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that my Chancellor constituents should have the same benefits on strike day as those living in France, Italy and Spain?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. There's no reason why her constituents should suffer lesser protection than perhaps people who live in other European nations, most of whom are most days are recognised for being particularly pro-union and particularly helpful in their settlement. So I cannot see why members opposite would object. All we're saying that in certain services, I'll give way in just a moment, I'd like to get through a little bit more. All we're saying that in certain services within these important sectors, this must be balanced against the needs of the public to rely, for example, on a basic level of life-saving care. The legislation simply brings us into line, as my honourable friend and others are just saying, with many other modern European nations. Countries like Spain and Italy and France and Ireland have introduced minimum service levels, which they use in a common-sense way to reduce the impact of strikes. The International Labour Organization itself states minimum service levels can be a proportionate way of balancing the right to strike with the need to protect the wider public, and that is what we are doing. Our own unions subscribe to and support the ILO, and that is what we support as well. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Given way on that. On the claim in terms of minimum safety levels across Europe, is the Secretary of State aware that according to the OECD, on average, France lost 112 days per 1,000 workers between 2008 to 2018. Spain lost 76 strike days, Italy 42, whilst the UK only lost 20 strike days. This law is just to ban people taking illegal action to strike. Will he not admit that?
Well, look, I agree with the Honourable Gentleman, Honourable Lady. We've had a good working relationship for the last several decades, and she's right to point out that as a result we have suffered typically over the last 2 or 3 decades fewer strikes than some in continental Europe. We have, as I've explained a number of times though, seen in recent months a flare-up in strikes which are putting people's lives and livelihoods at risk. And this government, for one, isn't going to stand by and watch that happen. I give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. There's a lot of focus on Europe, but I'd like to focus on Gloucestershire. The nurses in Gloucestershire have chosen not to strike, and I thank them for that, and I thank them for all the work they do in Stroud. But there is nothing that I see in this legislation that will prevent them making those difficult decisions to strike or to not strike and not join their colleagues and unions, because we're protecting those rights. It is the minimal standards that the public need.
Well, honourable friend's absolutely right. This is about minimum standards. So for anybody who cares about the ability to take industrial reaction, the ability to strike, what we're doing here enshrines that. This does not remove people's ability to strike. What it does is to prevent the ability of perhaps union bosses who aren't being as reasonable as the RCN, the Royal College of Nursing, have been, to cause strikes which potentially put people's lives at risk. And that is a very different proposition, which I'm proud to support. The government expects to consult on minimum service levels for ambulance, for fire and for rail services first. It's expected that these consultations will be published during the passage of this bill. At the same time as bringing forward the legislation, this government is doing all it can to continue the discussions that everybody is calling for to make sure that we get a pay settlement with unions which is actually affordable for the unions and for the country and for the workers paying for it. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Thank you to the Secretary of State. The government has ruled out, as far as I can tell, voluntary options 1 and 2 in their assessment on the basis that they will be ineffective, particularly where unions and employers have major disagreements. So the question is, why and how is he and his government arrived at that now in advance of the actual legislation itself?
Well, I think because we were given adequate demonstration from the recent strikes that in some cases, unfortunately, some of the participants, the unions involved, have not acted in, I think, the national interest, whereas others, the RCN, for example, have very much done so. So I want to just stress what I said right at the top of the statement, which is that I don't want us to have to use this legislation if it's not required. And we've actually got live strikes going on, so we will be able to see where it is required and where it isn't required. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I feel I've been very generous with allowing interventions, and it's right to complete my segment so others can get on and speak. We're mindful and thankful for that incredible contribution that I was just referring to by public service workers in this country. And where unions insist, though, on disproportionate and sometimes plain unsafe levels of industrial action without informing, for example, the NHS and others, then we must take the necessary steps to protect the public. I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Can he tell the House how many people died in the care of the National Health Service during the recent periods of industrial unrest who would not have died had the provisions of this bill been enforced at the time?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the problem, as people will recognise, is that where you don't have a nationally agreed level of coverage, particularly in say, the ambulance service, it's very difficult to know or to predict what would have happened had the Army not stepped in. And I know from talking to colleagues that one of the problems been that because of the late notice nature and the randomised trust-by-trust agreements, they haven't been able to put in a national framework that means that it doesn't matter whether you live in Islington North or somewhere else, you will get coverage on those strike days. And we said it in our manifesto, so I'll repeat it now. It's not fair to let trade union leaders undermine the livelihoods of others, nor is it fair for them to put the lives and livelihoods at risk either. So we're simply asking this. I will give way, actually, because the Honourable Lady has been very persistent.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. Does he see the irony in expecting unions to ensure minimum safe service levels on strike days when his own government is failing to do so every other day? And what does he make of nurses' reports that, in fact, staffing levels are safer on strike days because unions are negotiating appropriate cover compared to non-strike days?
Well, I didn't quite follow her point on the railways. The railways on strike days are finding it hard to offer any service at all, even for key workers, even for the people that they sometimes claim to represent the most, the hard-working cleaner, the hospital porter. People who cannot do their jobs remotely are unable to get to their jobs and they are losing money. And people are becoming fed up with the forever strikes where the unions simply won't put the offer to their members in order for their members to even get a say. So minimum service levels are very important for that reason. I think I've covered numerous times why we think minimum safety levels protect people's lives. So we are simply asking this question today in this debate and in the second reading. The unions tell us when they're going to withdraw their labour so that we can agree a minimum safety level. Hardly revolutionary stuff, Madam Deputy Speaker, just a common-sense safety net to keep the public safe and ease some of the enormous anxiety that they felt over the last few months. Madam Deputy Speaker, failing to support this bill today means that members who oppose this legislation are essentially prepared to put the safety and welfare of their own constituents at risk. I commend this bill to the House.
What a silly boy.
The question is that the bill be now read a second time. As colleagues will see, we have well over 50 members and right honourable members wishing to catch my eye. So before I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, I just want to inform colleagues that there will be an immediate 4-minute time limit so that we can try to get everybody in. I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first, let me declare an interest as a proud, lifelong trade unionist. And I regret at the start, Madam Deputy Speaker, the tone of the Secretary of State's response today, because to suggest or imply in any way that members of this House do not care about their constituents and put their constituents first, and that members of our vital public services that got us through the pandemic in some way do not take the safety of their people who they look after seriously and walk away. I think the Secretary of State should reflect on his comments today. Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been a member of this House for some 7 years now, and I cannot recall a measure that is at once so irrational and so insulting. Not only is it a vindictive assault on the basic freedoms of British working people, but this legislation is as empty of detail as it is full of holes. So we will oppose the sacking of nurses bill, and not just nurses, Madam Deputy Speaker, but also many of the key workers who we clapped and who kept our services going in the face of the pandemic. And we will vote against it tonight. And the next Labour government will repeal it. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are in the middle of an economic crisis of the government's making. Working people are facing the largest fall in living standards in a generation. And the Secretary of State keeps shouting Putin, but what about Liz Truss? What about the Conservatives crashing the economy? What about about the Conservatives crashing the economy. The Secretary of State forgets the fact that it's inflation that's gone through the roof under their watch. 13 years of Conservative failure. And members who are watching this debate and constituents up and down this country know the truth, Madam Deputy Speaker, and they will tell this government what they think come the next general election. But working people are facing the largest fall in living standards in a generation. In-work poverty, insecure work and financial insecurity are rampant. Inflation in double digits. It's in this context that we've seen the greatest levels of strike disruption in 33 years. Ambulance workers taking their first major strike action in decades. The first ever strike in the history of the Royal College of Nursing. Our posties, train drivers, border force, health workers, train cleaners and even Minister's own officials have all taken action too. The Prime Minister won't admit it, but this is a crisis, and it's a crisis of their making. This legislation does nothing to resolve the problems that they have caused. There is nothing common sense about it at all, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll happily give way.
I thank my friend for giving way. I declare an interest as a proud trade union member. Will my honourable friend agree with me that this legislation does nothing to address the underlying reasons why the NHS staff and others have taken the incredibly difficult decision to strike? We're going to spend a number of hours in here this evening. Surely that time would be much better spent by the government getting around the table with members of the NHS, listening to their concerns and coming to some resolution that will help move things forward rather than wasting our time here this evening on this horrible piece of legislation.
I thank my honourable friend for that contribution. I absolutely agree, and I was reflecting whilst the Secretary of State was making his opening speech, and I was thinking, if I still worked in social care or one of these key public services, if I was a paramedic, if I was a nurse, if I was one of those key workers that the Secretary of State mentioned listening to this debate, I'd be really upset and offended by the way the Secretary of State represented them here today. And that's not what the Labour Party thinks of those key workers. And also the Secretary of State claimed that this legislation is about public safety. So why does the bill not mention safety once? He knows full well that working people already take steps to protect the public during strikes, with derogations and voluntary agreements, yet he brazenly claims this punitive legislation is needed because of ambulance workers. It's insulting and it's shameful and it actually, I think he should apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the way in which he has represented ambulance workers who have been awfully smeared by the Secretary of State. I'll happily give way.
I thank my Unison comrade for giving way, because I'm a proud trade unionist. I'm not a member of a CLP, but I'm a proud trade unionist. Can my good friend remind the House that under existing legislation, Section 240 of the 1992 Trade Union and Labour Relations Act guarantees that trade unions must provide and agree to life and limb cover during an industrial dispute, because failure otherwise could result in a custodial sentence, and this bill is completely, therefore, unnecessary.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and we may not be in the same party, but I know we're in the same trade union. But these brave, hard-working men and women struck local life and limb deals, trust-by-trust basis, ahead of all strikes. And the Secretary says trust by trust, but it is the best way to ensure the right care is provided. And those employers know that. Those employers know that. When I was a home help, we always put patient care first, and we did negotiate and make sure that there was minimum safety levels, which is more than I can say for the Secretary of State, where we've seen excessive deaths and our crisis in the NHS increasing under his watch. I'll happily give way.
Which one? Well, I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I too declare an interest as a proud trade unionist and a trade union lawyer for many years before entering Parliament, representing striking workers day in, day out, and I know that no worker takes the decision to strike lightly, and these strikes have been caused by the cost of living crisis caused by this Conservative government. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this is just a further attack on workers' rights, like the 2016 anti-trade union legislation that this government introduced? It's just yet another attack on working people that keep us safe day in and day out.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I think people who have been watching this debate can see from the Secretary of State's opening remarks and his remarks previously what this is, and this smokescreen about allegedly needing these minimum service levels, when we know, because last autumn his own government assessed that minimum service levels weren't needed in emergency services due to existing regulations and voluntary arrangements. We all want minimum standards, Madam Deputy Speaker, and safety and service and staffing levels, and we want it every day, but it's the Minister that's failing to provide them. And instead of holding them to account, they seek in this bill to grab sweeping new powers to impose burdens on employers and remove basic rights from workers across our public service. An attack on every nurse, health worker and firefighter in this country. They've gone from clapping nurses to sacking them.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way. I know that my mum is a member of the RMT, something that I've noted in this House before, and it's interesting to me what the Secretary of State has been saying about the need for this bill and the legislation more widely. When he was Secretary of State for Transport, in fact, the only negotiations that have not been settled with RMT are those that the Department for Transport is involved in, because actually every single other dispute with the RMT has been resolved. So is this bill not just covering up his own failure to negotiate basic trade union agreements?
Well, my honourable friend makes some very important points, and I think we can all see from the reports regarding the negotiations that there was genuine hope that we could get to a settlement, and then the government decided to bring in new conditions at the last minute to try and make sure that this was a continued dispute. It's the government that's acting in a militant way and doesn't want to resolve these disputes, not the trade union. And also, the government should reflect those key workers and the workers that will be affected by this strike action, who he says put people's lives at risk, are also usually, if it's not them who are the key workers, but I'm pretty certain that most people, like my honourable friend, are someone who's a relative or friend or someone who they know who does that job. And we all think they're heroes, and we all know that they put their patients and those people they look after and those services that they provide at the forefront of their mind. And no one wants to take strike action, least of all the workers who lose a day's pay. I have long urged ministers to